Professor, a renowned scientist and researcher, a man who dedicated his entire life to the pursuit of knowledge in the most remote and dangerous corners of the world. The last expedition ended unexpectedly. He tore his back while getting out of the hot air balloon. Despite his significant academic authority in language and communication studies, his physical condition forced him to suddenly and radically change his plans. He decides to fully entrust the continuation of his vital research to his student Hakabi. Hakaba listens with anxiety and determination as the heavy responsibility falls on him. With the burden of this mission on his shoulders, the young researcher sets out into the field, a mysterious and threatening place known as the Otherworld. Finding himself on a desert, jagged edge, he watched as the hot air balloon that brought him shrank to a tiny speck in the boundless sky, and the realization hit him hard. There is no turning back for at least a year, and he is now truly alone. Arriving in the Otherworld on October 16, he learned that the guide was supposed to wait in a settlement 10 kilometers away. But the road ahead is dangerous. These lands, they say, are inhabited by a community of werewolves. He knows that these creatures are notorious for wild cruelty, often attacking anyone who dares to step onto their territory without warning. Despite the looming threat of these beasts, he begins his long trek through the barren's wilderness, wondering if he will really be able to get out of here alive and unharmed. He lies motionless in the snow, low, guttural growls of the pack vibrating through the frozen ground around him. When the beast approaches to sniff his lying body, he bitterly realizes that he was not felled by a brutal attack, but only by the crushing weight of his own gear and exhaustion from the journey. To his astonishment, the growling and whining of the creatures in his head begin to form into an understandable language, and he listens as they discuss his arrival and decide to call their appointed guide. The young researcher froze in surprise when a clear voice called him by name, and then with deep relief realized he can finally communicate with them, and his research into the language of beasts has begun to bear fruit. His hopes are shattered when the conductor approaches a young girl named Suzuki, an impressive combination of human and wolf traits, who explains that her father taught her the human language out of gratitude for the professor having once helped him recover. Following his new companion to the settlement, he notices with research curiosity that the inhabitants have settled in existing human structures and live in ruins, hardly changing anything in the architecture. He stops to examine a worn wooden sign marking this place as the village of Pachatak, a remnant from the times when humans still walked these lands. Determined to start the research correctly, the scientist asks Suzuki to lead him to the largest building. The logic is simple. The pack leader must live in the most prominent structure of the village. He follows Suzuki into a house that was once the home of the village head and has now become a storeroom. Rows of fish hang from the beams, drying in the cool air inside. After inspecting the food supplies, he asks where the leader is, and the conductor says that the leader has been among them all along and explains the pack is preparing provisions for winter, hence so much dried fish. A massive fur-covered figure confidently steps forward and announces himself as the leader. Suzuki immediately vouches for the companion, introducing him as a friend of her father. The full weight of the moment falls on the young man. This is his first official diplomatic communication in the local language. He recalls all the intricacies of the beast people's language. Human vocal cords are unsuitable for it. It relies on harsh, aggressive sounds, on words spoken on the inhale rather than the exhale. For any outsider, it is an awkward and difficult process to master. Gathering his strength, he tries to politely greet them in their language, but the pronunciation comes out tense and lisping. He barely catches his breath while speaking and introduces himself with a broken, airy tone that sounds foreign in his throat. The leader bursts out with a deafening roar, mouth wide open, which echoes through the room. Frightened that his poor pronunciation was taken as an insult, the traveler frantically apologizes and pleads that he never intended to mock. Instead of anger, the pack approaches with curiosity. One of the beasts warmly welcomes him and tells him to feel at home. Suddenly, the tension breaks. The creatures crowd around, their long tongues sticking out to lick his face. Soon he realizes that this is not an attack but a greeting. Licking is an integral part of their body language, a physical expression of affection and acceptance into their circle. He endures the fervent greeting, his face covered in saliva, while the pack members gently lick him. Wiping his cheek, he briefly recalls previous contacts with the professor and wonders if etiquette requires him to respond in kind with the same physical action. In a moment, the young traveler is drawn into a tight, furry embrace, and when the huge beast squeezes him firmly, he cannot help but think of the immense devotion the professor must have shown to earn such closeness from the pack. When he finally broke free from this turbulent greeting, a she-wolf with gentle eyes addressed him and sincerely thanked him for the hospitality. Her voice carried a tender maternal tone, while in the distance, a long mournful howl pierced the night sky and echoed through the mountain pass. Covered in foreign fur and still wet from saliva, he sits exhausted and pulls a matted clump of fur from his mouth. Suzuki looks at him with a mixture of pity and a smile, thinking he shouldn't have pushed himself so hard, although he quietly prides himself on having survived such an exhausting first day of cultural immersion. As soon as they settled, the conversation turned to his predecessor. The female wolf admitted that the professor was so eager to join their pack that he even sniffed their rears to pretend to be one of them. He froze for a moment, stunned both by the extreme methods and by the fact that this woman spoke his language so clearly. She skillfully wields a large blade, preparing food, and says that humans have not been accepted here since the time of her husband, recalling the professor's observations about how strangely similar their species are, and her voice turns somber as she again recounts that once other humans lived in the village, whom they called monsters and drove out with cold steel. The heavy silence was broken by a clatter. Suzuki accidentally dropped a bowl. It clanged and rolled to the floor. The mother calmly asked her to pick it up, but the young man instinctively reached out and offered help to the clumsy girl. During the shared meal, the woman calls herself Dry Grass, says that she was the one who taught her husband the human language, and confirms that Suzuki is her biological child. He listens attentively, sensing the depth of the bond between the professor and this family, and says he has come to take the old man's place among them. He sat by a small light, pen in hand, writing thoughts in a diary, and realized that his first fear of werewolves probably arose from the simple impossibility of understanding each other. When they were able to speak to one another, the fear of the unknown dissipated, but his quiet reflections were interrupted by Dry Grass, who called him, checking if he was still far away. This sudden call instantly threw him back to when he arrived. In the darkness above him loomed a huge roaring beast, its eyes glowing with a predatory gleam. The shock of that first encounter tore a desperate scream from him. When he returned to the present, he tried to explain his early outbursts to the young girl and her mother, confessing that the darkness and those shining eyes had really frightened him. Dry Grass, showing maternal care, draped a heavy fur over his shoulders and said that without his natural fur he would definitely have frozen. Later, settled for the night in the children's quarters, he reviewed the day's events. Dry Grass sincerely thanked him for his politeness, saying he had made an effort to greet everyone in the pack, even the smallest, and they greatly appreciated it. Suzuki looked at him wide-eyed and inquisitive, as if pleased by his presence in their home. Unexpectedly, the young she-wolf leaned down and gently licked his cheek. He froze, eyes wide open at this sudden primal display of acceptance and familial bond. When she innocently asked why he would not respond with the same gesture, he felt he had to maintain professional boundaries, although an old professor's warning was already spinning in his memory. The old man said that different races have their own customs, and a researcher should not be bound only by human values when striving to understand the world of others. Choice arises to strike, use a skill, or check tools, but it is decided simply to move on. Akaba and Suzuki stand ready to proceed further, flanked by their towering werewolves under the boundless sky. The morning of October 17 arrived after a restless night, the group still huddled together to keep warm in a shared sleep. Upon waking, Suzuki brushed a stray hair from her eye and Akaba was momentarily concerned. She explained that molting is natural and that her fur cloak is made from the shed hair of her late grandmother, glued to the fabric, a revelation that dispelled his grim suspicions about their attire. Only the two of them sit at breakfast. Werewolves live by a different rhythm, rarely eating heartily and meanwhile fasting for several days. He tastes with surprise the dishes are surprisingly delicious, asks what they are made of, and she just shrugs and says that in her family they eat what is served without asking questions. Nearby, the werewolves exchange sharp, guttural barks which are completely incomprehensible to his untrained ears. She tries to bridge the gap, explaining that he lacks the words to describe their conversation, and he finally gives up trying to translate her. He sits among the quiet pack and the only sound is the rhythmic chewing of their food. The air is heavy, there is none of the usual chatter around the communal table, and he is troubled by the thought. Is this cold silence the norm in every house of this village, since even the little ones eat without a word? The next morning he tries to break the ice and cheerfully greets a villager passing by, but to his words he receives a quick and silent rebuff. The werewolf moves on without even glancing his way, and he is left awkwardly standing in the cold. He stands by the central well and watches as people glide through the streets like ghosts. They skillfully and differently avoid him and each other, never paying attention to their neighbor and not even giving a simple nod. It becomes clear that this is not just the oddity of one family, and icy silence reigns throughout the village. Even werewolves pass by each other without a word or gesture, and this seems increasingly unnatural to him. Determined to overcome the chasm, he approaches a villager to start a conversation. The werewolf warns him about the fierce winters ahead, but when he says he will then head to the goblin caves, the creature freezes genuine shock on its face, and it looks at the sands as if asking them a question. Feeling the tension, he wonders if his light small talk is inappropriate, but the villager's attention turns away. The werewolf mentions food since early morning and mysteriously advises trying bark when he gets there, and this leaves him even more puzzled. Recalling a possible lead, he reached into his backpack for the professor's old field notes, hoping that somewhere on the yellowed pages hides an explanation for the strange behavior and mysterious advice he encountered in this silent village. His eyes widen when he finds a specific illustration, a preserved cross-section of a giant antleid worm. Realization hits him with nauseating clarity as he connects it to the tasty dish he ate earlier and finally understands what exactly he consumed. He recalls the professor's last instructions: use the linguistic groundwork I gave you and observe the world with your own eyes. Leafing through the field notes, he looks for any clue that will show him the way. He is pulled from his thoughts. A villager asks where he is heading next to the goblin cave. He confirms the plans but is momentarily confused when addressed simply as Baldy. Then the werewolf asks for a favor. Will he deliver a certain item to a friend who lives in those caves? He readily agrees, eager to repay those who sheltered him. The creature rushes off into the distance and he feels like he was struck by lightning. He never found out who this supposed friend is. Suzuki stands aside, her face unreadable. She only watches his confusion. Returning to his young companion, he asks if people in their village simply do not like to talk, since they share so little. He explains his observations in detail, how they suddenly cut off conversations and barely communicate with each other, even within families, and Suzuki tilts her head as if surprised that he is surprised for her. This is normal behavior. He vented his irritation, expressing his dissatisfaction, wondering how to fulfill this request without any clear instructions, and she simply picked up a small sharp object and said that he must find the one who carries this exact scent so she could recognize him. This exposes a deep chasm between their worlds. Humans rely on the sounds of speech and clarity of sight, while werewolves possess another, the language of sense, which weighs much more than any spoken word. The world of shapeshifters is built on the language of sense, invisible to the human eye. Their senses are so sharp that a single scent carries a true treasury of information, far more than any familiar human fragrance. She explains to him that when they are close there are no secrets. A werewolf senses what a person has eaten, where they have traveled, and even their physical condition, and he shudders, suddenly realizing how there is no privacy in such an intimate world of sensations. He sits quietly beside her, pondering the consequences of this discovery and wondering if entire conversations are taking place between them in that silence. The village remains calm, but the air is heavy with a dialogue he cannot continue. His thoughts again turn to his teacher as he imagines that these sensations can convey complex ideas and concepts for which humans have no words. This is a special kind of communication, where certain scents perform specific, important roles in their society. She leans in close and sniffs him, her curiosity turning into a series of quick, rhythmic inhales, and he feels a bit overwhelmed. After she thoroughly sniffed everything, she suddenly changes her mood and demands that he stroke her head. They saw the villagers gathering and taking instruments for a solemn farewell. The music became the last sign of kindness before their departure. The instruments are visible, but the true depth of the performance remains a mystery to the human ear. He noticed that the werewolves reacted as if to a fiery rhythm, but most of the sounds were probably beyond human hearing, so he could only guess what the melody was. When they aimed for the goblin cave, she excitedly spoke about the chance to find something tasty, and he was completely confused by her mysterious hint. He barely kept up, his breath breaking into ragged sighs as they made their way through the wild. It was mid-October. The path to the goblin cave proved exhausting, so, considering it unwise to move further, he set up camp halfway, choosing rest over haste. While the fire crackled, he proudly showed the first carved fire-starting stick, a small but very important achievement, and nearby the young she-wolf diligently worked on her project and admitted that hunting was not her strength, but she found meaning in making tools for her tribe and intends to master this craft when she grows up. Suddenly, from the darkness, a large shimmering mass crawled toward the warmth of their fire, and he watched in fascination as a translucent creature settled nearby, its surface rippling in the firelight. While his companion was absorbed in needlework, he watched the visitor intently. He recalled a lecture where the professor once proposed a radical theory. These creatures, called no water, understood human language and had intelligence far higher than most imagined. Back then, the professor was ridiculed because the sample was too small to prove it, but now, seeing a specimen of this size, he realized this was a rare opportunity. This was his chance to finally confirm the professor's incredible words. He sighed if only he could treat these beings as true guests, the world would finally see the truth. With a surge of determination, he decided to communicate with the creature just like with any local inhabitant, greeted it warmly and sincerely, and wished the shining being a good evening. To his surprise, the creature rippled in waves and responded with a soft, bubbling voice. He replied in turn, said he was glad to meet it, thereby confirming everything the professor had ever claimed. He leans forward, trying to bridge the gap between species, but his greeting is interrupted by Sasuke's sharp warning. The slime's attempt to speak initially produces a wet, vibrating sound that later forms a polite, though somewhat confused, greeting. Before he could respond, the creature lunges forward. A sudden wave of translucent jelly pushes him onto his back. He lies there, soaked and stunned, while the slime settles on him as a cold, heavy mass. The young she-wolf, seeing his trouble, begins to dance rhythmically. Her boots deliberately and loudly stomp on the ground, and the slime instantly reacts to the vibrations, retreating from the fallen man and emitting a quiet, rhythmic bubbling in response to her movements. He instantly flips through the professor's journals and finds a record confirming Suzuki's actions. Indigenous tribes long knew that these creatures communicate through vibrations, often touching the ground with their feet to establish contact. When he hesitantly asks if the creature perceives him as a threat, it shakes its head and reassures him they are safe. She pulls out a simple wooden instrument and presses its wide, bell-shaped end to the shimmering surface of the slime. Her face shows sharp concentration as she prepares to listen to the vibrations caught in the wicks. Explaining that this method was shown to her by one of her father's subordinates, she beckoned him closer and insisted he press his ear to the device, and he suddenly shuddered, realizing that this primitive device strangely resembled the specialized equipment the professor used in the laboratory. He presses his ear to the wood. The muffled vibrations in his head become clear, ringing thoughts. The creature is curious, inquiring about their journey through the mountains, and strangely, bubbling, thanks them for the meat they gave earlier. The sensation of listening through a wooden tube awakens a distant childhood memory. A doctor applied a similar instrument to hear the heartbeat of his yet unborn sister. It is a moment of deep connection that links the science he once abandoned with the ancient secrets of the wild. He carefully records this common object, noting the thin leather membrane and the hollow, cup-shaped handle. Unable to disassemble the device, his drawing relies solely on its external appearance, capturing the flared edge and the fact that everything is made from a single piece of bark-like material. When he looked at the letter from the professor, he learned that the slime actually migrates to warmer regions, escaping the deadly winter cold. In the postscript, it turned out that the professor had placed the slime in a backpack so that it would safely reach its destination. Standing next to the translucent creature, he and his companion wondered how the local slime would receive this tired traveler, and he hoped that if they encountered another one like it, both would be allowed to meet. Suddenly another slime appeared, and he immediately wondered how the two would interact. Thinking that their language is based on vibrations, he assumed they would probably communicate directly through touch. He held his breath as the two jelly-like forms finally touched. A barely perceptible wave of oscillation ran between them. To his surprise, the returning traveler and the local did not just greet each other, they merged into one, transforming into a single large hole right before his eyes. What he saw made his head spin. He began to doubt the very nature of their existence and wondered if this merging was a way to better transmit vibrations. The thought that he would have to return home and physically merge with an old friend oppressed him. Although confused, he sincerely thanked the creature and said that observing its unique way of life had become a truly fascinating journey. He sits by the crackling fire and listens as a young she-wolf tells how the locals regard the appearance of slime creatures. To the locals, they are like travelers returning, one of many who migrate in predictable cycles. When the jelly-like creature begins to speak, it tells of a meeting with another named Gouge in a place called Utatsu, where they parted and reunited, and when it turns out that this creature speaks her language, the girl froze with wide-open eyes in shock because she remembered that Gouge often spoke to her. The traveler froze, looking at the shimmering figure, and suddenly realized these creatures can split into independent selves, and for a moment he was filled with envy. He imagined how useful it would be to be in two places at once. He thoughtfully asked himself whether the slime that visited his side was not just a separated part of the body of that great creature, and the girl skeptically shook her head. To Uau, it was too great a distance to simply connect it that way. Interested in their biology, he asks whether the creature feels the need to return to its original body. The girl points to the merged mass and says that since they became one whole, the boundary between the past and present I has disappeared. The question, "Who am I?" leads the traveler into a dead end. He cannot understand how this creature differs from the previous ones. The slime itself wonders, could there even be a version of it that would not be I? And the girl quietly notes that such abstract notions of self are alien to its kind. She takes out a small glass jar and tells a bitter truth. The creatures move so slowly that many freeze in winter and do not reach their destination. To avoid this, locals carry the slimes in their containers. This practice is called partial transportation. These observations coincide with the mysterious notes of the professor, in which the slugs appear as a living bridge between seasons. Although many of the scientists' works were assumptions, their very dependence on temperature and the help of travelers create a clearer picture of their struggle for survival. She watches as the young man prepares to set off, the backpack securely fastened, determination unwavering. He announces departure, gently asks not to be silent if he feels pain, and with relief notes that his ankles have finally recovered after yesterday's strain. Setting out this 18th of October, he counts their progress, hoping to reach the goal by noon, and his thoughts drift to the nature of the slimes they carry. Although they are called no water, these creatures remain a mystery, and their mind seems to grow along with the mass. The little she-wolf lifts her head and looks wide-eyed with curiosity in her eyes when told how cute she is. She has already started walking on her own, but this compliment slightly confuses her. She tilts her head as if asking a quiet question. Her expression blooms with every praise. One can see that inexhaustible energy in her. She is truly strong and full of life, and her figure sharply stands out against the quiet, cold morning as she walks lightly and effortlessly. With a wide, toothy smile, she shines from being considered a great helper. Energy and usefulness fill the young traveler with pride, and under the heavy fur cloak her tail probably wags, though it is not visible. A step away from the cave stands a strange, dead tree, like a silent guardian. Its twisted branches are decorated with several faded ribbons tightly wrapped around the trunk. Approaching the landmark, the young she-wolf caught a scent in the wind. Her nose twitched. She pointed to one path and suggested to her companion to walk a bit in that direction, relying on instincts. Following her, the traveler came across a patch of vegetation. His eyes lit up with the joy of discovery, and he thought that even a slightly better understanding of unfamiliar languages and nature gave him deep happiness. Soon after lunch, they reached the entrance to the cave, and he noticed that the ribbons tied to the trees here were exactly the same as those that wrapped the package they were entrusted to deliver. While he pondered this connection, his young ward joyfully extended a handful of mushrooms she had gathered, impatient to prepare and eat them, and he thanked her, acknowledging that her keen eyesight greatly eased the journey. While the girl settles down to enjoy the find among their swirling companions, he decides to move on to scout the surroundings. Emerging from the shadows, he is stunned to see a group of lizard folk peacefully basking in the midday sun, a sight that surprises him because there are no goblins or werewolves. Despite the possible danger, he decides to take the risk and try to speak peacefully with these reptiles. He watches them carefully, noticing how they huddle close together and sleep, behavior that contradicts their reputation as a warlike and heartless race, so he cautiously steps forward and politely greets the sleeping group. From a safe distance, a shaggy beast named Mal watches what is happening with a vigilant, silent gaze. They get involved in the daily routine. The traveler stirs a pot of boiling plants, and Sasuke nearby intently braids a rope. The traveler asks what these plants are for and gladly helps with simple tasks that slightly erase the distance between their worlds. He watches closely a massive, shaggy creature named Mao. It keeps to the side but occasionally comes to help. From its thick fur peeks a small snake-like creature that sharply cries out, and he takes this as a warning. Do not eat what is nearby. Because of the creature's tangled structure, he cannot understand where one being ends and another begins. Holding a bowl, he hears the same snake head make that sound again, and this confirms his suspicion that this sound means the order not to eat. Suddenly, a piercing cry from his younger companion breaks his concentration and forces him to stop. He was standing dangerously close to the tongues of flame, though he barely noticed the heat because his mind was absorbed by the realization that the tail movements of the elder werewolf exactly mirrored the gestures of the harpy heads, and this became a breakthrough in his study of the language. The sudden discovery hits him, his eyes open wide as he connects that rhythmic pattern with movement, quickly writes it down in notes and understands. He has finally deciphered the signal for Tawa. When the midday sun reached its peak, work stopped and the huge beast Mao called everyone present to join a communal meal. While others began to prepare, Hakaba looked at his charred boots and clothes, noticing how informal and somewhat undefined their breaks were. His quiet reflections are interrupted when a small creature with a long neck suddenly lunges at him with an open mouth. He recoils in surprise and wonders whether this unexpected aggression is a new way of communication or a real threat. In response to the creature's click, he notices a subtle change in its posture and sound and suddenly realizes a slight difference in the signal completely changed the meaning. It is no longer a warning. Now the gesture clearly means that it is going to eat. He turned to the young she-wolf beside him and asked if she had already begun to catch the nuances of this complex silent language. She modestly admitted that she knew only a little, and he involuntarily admired how much faster the youth absorbs the world around than he himself manages. He stands and thinks about the future. His thoughts drift to his wife and the children they might have, and suddenly a quiet memory of a moment with Suzuki and his partner surfaces in his mind. This pushes him to a darker realization. His nation sees the afterlife only as a source of resources, and its inhabitants as property like dry grass, so he cannot help but worry where Suzuki fits into this cold calculation. The burden of his research again brings before his eyes his great-grandmother, the one from whom his linguistic searches began, and who became the last keeper of the dying language. Looking at the girl beside him, he gently assured her that she was not destined to share the lonely fate of the old woman, and his students looked at him with wide-open eyes in surprise. She takes his words literally, asking if he will not age at all, and this throws him into confused panic as he awkwardly tries to explain his clumsy attempt to comfort. The young traveler stood next to a massive, furry beast and, without taking his eyes off the open pages of the journal, tried to understand why this creature was here. The beast stretched out its paws dripping with water, as if offering something or waiting in the cold air. Sitting down to record his observations, he carefully made sketches and wrote while the creature looked at him with curiosity and silent tension, and the rhythmic tapping of its claws on the frozen ground interrupted the silence of their meetings. Suddenly, the beast tilted its large head so close that its nose barely touched his shoulder and made a series of muffled, hoarse sounds. He looked up in surprise, realizing that the animal was gesturing toward his meager supplies, as if asking whether he himself intended to eat them. By December 16, the piercing cold of the wasteland had become a constant companion, and the only sound in that endless open plain from time to time was the heavy plop of a body into the snow. He stood over the great beast, nestled in the snowdrifts, and thought about how difficult his mission had turned out to be. In recent days, he had hardly managed to find common ground with the more upright inhabitants of these lands. Later, he immersed himself in his linguistic notes, upset that his last attempt to use the Lamian language did not bring a real breakthrough. He carefully laid out the components of the verb and specific markers in the word gotta, but the nuances of their language still tantalizingly eluded him. His research continued, and he noticed one sharp blow to the body could turn a simple statement into a direct question, a trivial detail he had glimpsed while observing the recent interactions of his young companion nearby, while the she-wolf girl was completely absorbed in the meal, not noticing those complex grammatical puzzles he was trying to solve, which, watching the giant creature resting, he couldn't shake the thought of why it always lay down just as he began work. Behind him, the girl continued eating with appetite, her simple joy sharply contrasting with his own scientific frustrations. He thinks about how everything changed in these 3 days. The hairy beast Mao almost always wanders outside the settlement, and Suzuki disappears after work, returning in the evening with a bag of dry grass and sternly warning him that it is not for eating. Watching from afar, he sees her laughing and playing with the giant beast and the little reptile, and it becomes clear to him that while he was buried in study, she managed to establish real connections and find friends among the inhabitants of this land. He is suddenly pierced by a sharp pang of self-reproach, clutching his head in frustration, regretting that he falls into these moods again and breaks down, but reminds himself that he once managed to overcome such internal blocks. In his thoughts, the early days as a student with Professor Gotcha arise again. He remembers how the locals hardly spoke to him while they communicated freely with his companions. The professor was harsh and spoke plainly. People cannot get close to someone who sees them only as objects of linguistic research, not as people with their own lives. Returning to the present moment, he sits alone on the shore, allowing the cold water to numb his bare feet, and admits that he is falling into the same old trap again, confessing to himself that his obsession with the mechanics of language has once again created a barrier between him and the surrounding world. While he sits in gloomy reflections, the silence is broken by the approach of a large feathered griffin. The creature lands nearby, its sharp claws clicking on the frozen ground, and it intently watches the solitary man sitting by the stream. The bird-like beast moves strangely and unsteadily, and all its attention is fixed on the water where the man's feet are submerged. Suddenly, the griffin and its companion leaned over him, their huge silhouettes looming not as a threat but with almost maternal tenderness, as if urging him to come out of melancholy or simply offering the connection he feared to lose. He looked at this tall creature and realized, although it was an indispensable guide who led them to the village, he knew almost nothing about it personally. Seeing that the beast was clearly struggling, he gently nudged it to lie down, noticed that it was in a serious condition, and aloud asked if it felt the care he was trying to give it. When the huge bird-cat-like hybrid settled into the soft snow, it sat nearby. The silence of the winter landscape was broken only by their breathing. He got to work, his hands moving carefully and precisely, tightening the bandages around the creature's body and making sure everything was secure. After the task was completed, the creature stood at full height, but a sudden, sharp bite on the hand caught him by surprise. Letting out a series of painful cries, he recoiled from the unexpected bite. He stepped back a little and sat down to rest. His gaze drifted to the heavy backpack, which had already begun to gather a thin layer of snow. Despite the slight wound, he returned to the creature and checked the fabric one last time to make sure his work would withstand the bad weather. The guide extended his hand, firmly tugged him by the sleeve, and then rhythmically tapped a stick on the frozen ground as if ordering to move on, leaving him to wonder whether his previous actions were unwanted interference or the creature was simply ready to set off again. He nestled against the creature's thick, snowy feathers and thought about their silent bond. Though there were no words, he felt a deep mutual understanding he had not known since he arrived. Soon he led the tired bees through the narrow doorway of the stone shelter, shielding them both from the piercing wind. He watched as it lay down on the dry straw bed. Its massive body finally found rest, and he remained nearby, attentive to its needs. He reached out to stroke the soft feathers and wondered, was the cold still bothering it, or did the beast simply crave the touch of the snow they had left behind? When the rhythmic tapping began to echo, he extended a bowl of dark berries to the creature and its little lizard, asking if this was the answer they had seen. He felt the sharp tartness of the fruit as the beast took the offering and its beak quickly grabbed a berry. He began to catch the rhythm of the sounds and realized that the gesture along with the tapping was a hint to share the food. Leaning back, he suddenly realized that the persistent knocking was not just a question about food, but a warm, silent invitation to travel the world together. He again returns in thought to his previous insight. The rhythmic tapping of the griffin looks like a hint, as if an invitation to eat ice, but he has no intention of doing so, so for a moment he is confused, trying to grasp the full meaning of the animal's language, and finds himself in a real predicament. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next video. Goodbye. In a moment, the creature still taps rhythmically and extends a bundle of dry branches. Because of its persistent hospitality, he finds himself in trouble, desperately looking for a way to politely refuse and make it clear that he is already full. That day, as he was leaving, the young traveler passed by the resting creature, and his thoughts suddenly returned to that important moment. He froze, noticing the guide's belongings gathered near the dwelling. They carried a heavy meaning. Salt, limestone, knives, and a large cauldron. It was impossible to confuse. These were the very tools he had seen prepared for the burial of the shaggy beast, a grim reminder of the local cycle of life. Since then, he and the young she-wolf visited the lair of that creature daily, noticing and recording their progress as the year slowly came to an end. Kneeling before the huge bird-like creature, he began communicating with a series of rhythmic taps, asking how it felt, and received a clear, affirmative answer. While the conversation continued, a small lizard-like creature watched from the shadows, and the girl looked on with curiosity, trying to understand the complex questions about what lies behind and the nature of being. The syntax of this ancient language was fascinating. Words were formed by adding certain particles to the basic verbal taps, which completely changed their meaning. He pondered the fragile uncertainty of their words. The same word could mean health, fire, possession, and this mystery made him and his young companion seek a deeper understanding. He looks at Suzuki, who says she wants more time to play with the creature she calls Wavetooth, and watching, he thinks about the complexity of their communication. One word, for example, fire, in the subtle context of the moment can completely change meaning, sometimes meaning snow, sometimes flame. Through this difficulty, he began to adopt her unique approach to learning. She learns by imitating the actions of others. She simply calls it a game, and he himself begins to do the same, repeating the movements of the creature. This change in strategy recalls the extreme methods of the professor. He was ready to sniff werewolves to truly understand them, and realized that with creatures whose perception differs so much from his own, mere observation is not enough. One must imitate what one wants to know. While they rehearse rhythmic tapping, she suddenly turns to him and addresses him as her teacher, looking at this interaction with quiet satisfaction and feeling that their progress is truly good. After a few moments, she adds a mysterious warning: certain preparations must be completed before the real winter cold arrives. He nods in response, but the anxiety in her voice slightly unsettles him. When he was unsettled, her gaze sharpened. She stated that an important change had already begun, told him that her mother taught her to notice such signs and now wants to pass this knowledge to him, making him wonder what exactly is unfolding. The creature leaned down to sniff him, and she explained that this individual was once a mother, so she might be a better companion for his training. He stood still, trying to decipher the intention of this creature close to him. Outside the dwelling, the rhythmic tapping does not cease, becoming a constant background to their conversation. While inside, he suddenly froze at the simple truth about her gender. Thoughts raced, trying to see the beast anew, since now he knew she was once a mother. He knelt beside the wounded creature and with relief noticed that the swelling had finally begun to subside, and although it turned out she was once a mother, his determination to care for her did not waver. When he stood up, Suzuki's voice sounded. She was calling him to follow her to share her knowledge, and although her sudden desire to help seemed unexpected, the way she so passionately wanted to join filled his heart with genuine warmth. Following her, they stepped into a dimly lit room where a giant hairy beast rested alongside several smaller, no less fluffy companions. He looked around the room, noticed the small creatures and the distinct smell of cheese being prepared, and Suzuki explained that she had befriended them and found a way to be useful in the house. In his mind flashed the image of her playful games with the little beast, how she sniffs fresh cheese and tumbles with the young. Now it was clear that the large creature was the father of this energetic brood. Suddenly she approached him with a determined look, extended the bowl, and jokingly called herself the mother of the group, while he just looked confused as she persistently asked him to accept her offer. She explained that because the babies were weaned, there was so much milk that it was turned into cheese. She insisted that he eat these leftovers, saying it would strengthen his health and give him energy. The true motive of her lesson was revealed when she said that he needed practice for the future, where he might have to care for a mother and child, and this realization hit him like a physical blow. He froze with wide-open eyes, speechless from the sudden weight of her words. He was clearly puzzled and did not understand why Suzuki was asking specifically about his relationship with the monster bison. Had he said something wrong? He recalled a similar misunderstanding with Kiku, while Suzuki just stared with wide, unwavering eyes as if saying, the answer should be obvious to him. Switching his thoughts to the biological mysteries of this world, he pondered the diversity of harpies and lizard people, about how such different creatures produce milk, and gradually realized mysterious criteria and laws of nature operate here, which he had not yet fully deciphered. His attention shifted to practical matters. Examining the bison-like monster, he noticed the strange placement of her udder in the lower part of the body, quite unlike the cattle he had dealt with during previous fieldwork, and the thought of milking seemed awkward and unusual to him. When he began to milk, the awkwardness of the situation pressed on him. Suzuki, who was watching from the side with interest, asked if the large beast was the father of the young ones, and he quickly warned her not to equate these creatures with human family relationships. Enough milk was collected, the whole community got to work. Other inhabitants ran to help, pasteurization began, and eventually, along with fresh milk, whey also appeared. He took the bowl with the liquid, sincerely thanked Suzuki for her help, and a memory from training surfaced. Whey has special properties that promote healing and recovery. He swallowed slowly and calmly for a long time, when suddenly he noticed a familiar figure nearby, Kiku, the lizard-like one, who looked at him so intently that it seemed to him she was waiting exactly for him to finish his work. The silence was broken by a sharp, hoarse sound. She greedily licked her lips, and when he met her predatory, expectant gaze, a slight anxiety ran through him. He watched closely as Kiku took a cautious sip, but she immediately began to cough and choke. Although she clearly did not like the taste, he was relieved. The fact that she could swallow it at all confirmed that their digestive systems were essentially compatible. Watching her further, he quietly admits that a feeling for his companion is growing in him, and that this connection may be confusing Suzuki. This closeness makes him urgently want to shorten the distance between them. He desperately wants to learn her language and find out her real name, and for the first time the feverish tone from the professor's old notes sounds truly personal and understandable to him. One of the creatures stirred, opened an eye with a slit pupil, and looked at the uninvited guest, then strangely and casually asked about sharing. The traveler was frozen in surprise, confused by the unexpected hospitality and the fact that the creature could communicate. He carefully considers the intricacies of the language. He notices that humans and lizard folk mostly pronounce words on the exhale, while werewolves growl and moan on the inhale, and compares phonetic limitations, concluding that some reptilian sounds are simply beyond the human voice. These sounds are rhythmic huffing in the throat and a sharp hiss of air through the teeth. To imitate the deep vibrations of a werewolf, a human must resort to strained falsetto or a hoarse, grainy voice which only gives a pale imitation of the real tone. Because of these deep differences, he is completely lost. He cannot understand a single word of the lizard folk, even though they supposedly speak the werewolf's language. The young traveler recalls the professor's parting words. In the other world, there is no common language. Races speak some fragmented pidgin of mixed words and interchangeable sounds. Recovering from the confusion, he decides to build a bridge with his hands, showing simple concepts and hoping to align their pronunciations. Seeing how hard it is for him, the young she-wolf intervenes and begins to translate. Although it clearly exhausts her for her kind, the main way of communication is sense, so constant speaking in a foreign language drains her strength. With her help, two reptilian travelers introduced themselves as Hashu and Kiku, explaining that they were from a settlement on a distant shore, and he was relieved to find that Professor Ever Meticulous had placed a special pronunciation guide for such cases in the back of his journals. Suddenly, both creatures lean down and firmly clamp his head between their powerful jaws and scaly snouts, and he wonders if this intimate, slightly frightening touch is the usual way lizards read. The pressure is incredible, and he barely utters apologies for his language mistakes as they continue to greet him with touches. It seems his theory about their customs is correct, though the experience itself is much more overwhelming than he expected. Hakaba asks if there are goblins here, but the lizard-like hosts calmly say, "There are none here. They are more foolish than hostile," and he is overwhelmed with relief because he is glad his social blunders were not taken as an attack. The more wolf-like inhabitants gather, the more their constant sniffing and complex communication through scents leave him completely lost in the conversation. He carefully examines their belongings, wondering if these are just possessions or grim trophies of past clashes. Soon he learns that these werewolves have taken on what goblins once did, growing and caring for a mysterious substance known as bark. The lizard people explain that this very bark is the reason for their visit, describing a sharp mixture of dried fish remains with which they feed theirs, while the reptiles considered it valuable, and the sharp-nosed werewolves recoiled from the stench and marveled at how the hairless could endure it. While the conversation was ongoing, a large werewolf stepped forward as a sign of hospitality and placed a tray with freshly pulled dorsal hearts of earthworms. He stared at the offering and realized. This is the local delicacy the villagers spoke about. After biting, he found the texture strangely soft, though the taste was unimpressive. His reptilian companions judge food by appearance and touch, and little Suzuki looks on impatiently, hoping to try at least a bit. The dish suddenly reminded him of the initial task, and he instantly remembered the package he was supposed to deliver. He looked at Suzuki, who had diligently carried the parcel all the way, and reaching out, suddenly realized the recipient of this package is the young she-wolf herself. She walked alongside the group before they set off. She strangely exchanged her mushrooms for pieces of pumice. When they left the cave, the sky blazed with the bright colors of a beautiful sunset. Kind lizards allowed the travelers to accompany them to the coastal settlement, which turned out to be the professor's next stop. On the way, two lizards proudly gleamed with scales and said their names were given according to colors. The first blazed deep red and the second shimmered with blue. Captivated by the vivid spectacle, the girl praised the wonderful colors of their scales, and this praise prompted a sudden joyful announcement from one of the lizard folk. He declared that at this very moment he had found a mate. The speed of the proposal stunned the others, but she, with a spark of recognition in her eyes, recalled that it reminded her of a story her mother once told about her father. Although everything was complicated and the alliance happened suddenly, the group still sincerely wished them well, and the young man was still trying to process the rapid turn of events. When minor misunderstandings in communication were left behind, the company officially set off toward the coastal settlement around 5 in the evening. The group is making their way through a dark tunnel to the coastal settlement. They say this is a path once left by a giant shell. Despite the late hour and darkness, no one stumbles and all boldly move forward. During the crossing, he learns how different races call each other. Werewolves call lizard folk big jaws, and lizard folk call werewolves softies. And he wonders how the werewolves see themselves, but Tsutsuki explains that among themselves they do not use such words. These names are rather for talking about others, not themselves. When night falls and they settle around the campfire, he reflects on what racial identity is and realizes, race names are more often external labels, and among their own such divisions are almost unnecessary. They continue talking under the warmth of the fire. The group is relaxed all together, enjoying quiet company amid the wild nature. The topic shifted to writing, and he could not believe it. The lizard folk were interested in human writing and even had their own visual words and idea that connected their cultures. Intrigued, he asked them to show him. He learned that although the werewolves use a phonetic system taught by the professor and recorded with the human alphabet, the lizard folk have a completely different language and complex writing system that existed long before their meeting. One of them takes a tool in hand and begins to write to leave a mark. The professor watches with interest as the process begins. The movements of the lizard folk are measured and precise. But the symbols that appeared took on a completely unknown form to him, a complex alien pattern that did not fit into his concept of language and stunned him. He stared at the single dark mark, pondering the lizard's statement that this was his entire written vocabulary. Hashu explained that the symbol simply means danger, and the scholar realized that based on one sample he could not decipher anything. More examples were needed to even begin to understand this foreign script. Solving the mystery, he noticed a shallow bowl with murky water swirling and involuntarily wondered, is the lizard folk writing really so poor? Or is the word danger simply the most important for survival in their harsh world? And the memory of the symbols from the cave flashed in his mind, adding another layer to the already deeper mystery. The lizardman pulled a small jar from his bag and, explaining that a mutual acquaintance had entrusted him to deliver it to the young she-wolf, said that inside was like a reproduction of her very appearance and scent, and this thought made Suzuki tilt his head in complete confusion, looking at those mysterious markings. Comparing the two samples, the difference struck immediately. Mark IV Danger was a uniform, graphite-like blotch, differing only in thickness, whereas the reproduction of the girl's essence burned as a bright canvas of chestnut, ochre, dark green, and stone gray, and it was precisely the number of colors that distinguished a simple warning from a complex description. He began to guess whether a special reading order was hidden in the sequence of colors, or the entire meaning arose from the combination of shades itself. He decided to simplify the forms in the notes, considering vertical strokes and floral patterns as separate linguistic elements, and assuming that the colors themselves carried important meaning. Seeing the scholar intensely focused, Kashu raised the stone palette and clarified his thought. He did not mean that danger was the only word he knew, but only that with that dark pigment he could only imprint it, and with a toothy smile added that now, having a full palette of colors, he could write much more. The tool that the lizardman pulled out was undoubtedly terrible. Its surface was covered with shallow wells for various pigments. This confirmation filled the researcher with a wave of confidence. His theory that their writing system was inextricably linked to color was confirmed. The work was tactile and measured. Kashi moistened the dried pigments with water to soften them, then applied them with a thick finger onto a piece of animal skin. He called Suzuki to watch how the symbols that marked her appeared, and she noticed with interest that the yellow paint was the same ochre shade familiar to her from there. He extends a torn scrap of parchment as a sample of his people's writing. Hakaba takes it and silently gazes at the dark, twisted paint, thoughts swirling in his head trying to comprehend that abstract sign. Looking closely at the sign, the young scholar understood with relief that his guess was correct. The figure itself meant nothing, it was just paint adjusted to the uneven edges of the hide. He had asked the lizards to record a description of their appearance and scent, but instead received something suspiciously resembling a danger sign, so the strokes themselves seem secondary. Something else must be more important. He is confused, watching how the arrangement of pigments constantly changes. He wonders if there is a certain order in which these colors should be read. Although he suspects that answers may be hidden in the professor's voluminous notes, he hesitates. It is easier to search the records, but the desire to discover everything himself calls stronger. Finally, he decides to go alone, recalling the mentor's words to look at this world with his own eyes and not just rely on someone else's observations. Resolutely set on his own breakthroughs, he decides to solve the linguistic puzzle without turning to academic records. While he is lost in thought, nearby the young she-wolf begins to behave strangely. She is completely absorbed in food and chews it as if it is the only thing in the world. Her behavior has nothing to do with that scientific dispute, and even when nudged, she seems unable or unwilling to explain the mysterious methods of the lizardmen. Realizing that her gaze is unlikely to give him the clarity he needs, he thought about a simple biological truth. Lizardmen see colors much better than humans, and this physiological advantage probably underlies their entire communication system, a depth of perception that neither he nor his companion can fully comprehend. The lizard-like warrior points to a certain shade on the palette and says that it is the literal embodiment of the scent of a she-wolf girl. This discovery stuns the scientist. The very thought that these creatures see smells as separate colors points to a grammar and logic almost inaccessible to an outsider. He notices, even when describing bodily presence, there is not a trace of drawing or pictogram in their writing. It is pure abstraction, where the essence of the being is not in its form, but in the unique spectrum of colors it throws into the extremely sharp eyes of the lizards. He extends the sketch to his reptilian comrades and explains that he has drawn portraits of both. In the spirit of their previous conversation, he hopes that this gesture will become a meaningful response to the complex text they shared with him. Despite the best intentions, the lizard people look at Utterbu Wildermut's parchment and say that they cannot decipher the drawing at all. For the young teacher, this is a humiliating discovery. In this alien world, the idea that art is a universal language clearly does not work. He observes them, constantly pondering how to truly repay their kindness, especially since their dyes are probably extremely valuable. The desire to find a common language burns within him, but the cultural gap turns out to be wider than he expected. His reflections are interrupted by one of the scaly creatures. It points to his head and asks for some hair, and he, suddenly frozen, turns to Suzuki, hoping she will suggest why they need it. She explains that these large jaws make painting tools from their own hair, and although they say only a little is needed, their impatient faces reveal they would gladly take as much as he can give. He allows them to proceed with a nervous but submissive smile. A clawed hand reaches out to his light hair, ready to collect the unusual material for their craft. When they accept both the sketch and the lock of hair, he thinks about the kindness they showed from the offer to carry his heavy backpack to their gentle gestures. He watches carefully as they begin to leave marks on the new surface and wonders what will come of his contribution. In the final scenario, he and Suzuki are described as truly good people, and this phrase seemed strangely humane to him. Next to him, Suzuki shines with pride and insists that the praise must definitely mention her. He and Suzuki decided to end the day and, trusting the night, watched over their lizards. The lizard people, having rested during the day, were full of energy and quite capable of standing guard while others slept. Settling in for the night when the clock was already approaching 11 o'clock on October 18, he lay under the boundless starry sky and thought about the path ahead. Coastal settlement was finally within reach the next day, and his thoughts returned to those they had left behind. His heart tightened with regret that he had not properly thanked the peasants and cave dwellers, so on the way back he decided to find a more worthy gift for them, something much more important than just a lock of hair. On the day of October 19, the travelers finally reached the settlement, and walking along the dirt path, the young teacher recalled how he had gotten used to the special rhythm of the language of the lizard people. Soon one of the local reptiles approached her and asked if their journey had started in the Goblin Cave. He calmly replied that they had come from somewhere else, correcting the misunderstanding. But that conversation prompted him to think about the linguistic differences of the region. Werewolves and lizard people pronounce the same name a little differently, Gagwin for some, Gafuan for others, but it was about the same annoying creatures. It was a small but important realization about the shared culture of these very different races. Looking out at the landscape, he saw a lively community. Lizard people and werewolves lived peacefully by the shore, and a wooden pier stretched into the sea, as if emphasizing that this place belonged simultaneously to both land and water. The dwellings throughout the area were clearly the work of the locals. Carefully built from sea-washed wood and hardy coastal plants, they were clear evidence of their ingenuity on this shore. One of their guides, Kiku, confidently claimed that he could build them a new home before sunset. Although the reptile's optimism was inspiring, the teacher could not shake the thought of what would happen if this bold plan failed. As soon as they began to look around, Kusho approached him and said that she and Kiku were brother and sister, and meanwhile the young she-wolf Suzuki tugged at his sleeve, her eyes burning with excitement, insisting that they move all the way to the shore. She rushed ahead, clutching a handful of pumice in her hand with a mischievous smile. He watched her with a smile and anxiety, unsure whether she really intended to dive in and whether the werewolf could withstand the biting cold of the coastal waves. He gazed at the shore, noticed the locals gathered near the water and the pier, and wondered were they preparing to swim or perhaps planning to fish together. To his growing confusion, the werewolves simply stood, their gazes fixed on the gentle waves lapping against the shore. They were still waiting, but for what remains a mystery. Even Suzuki stood frozen at the water's edge, having no intention of stepping into the cold surf. Suddenly near the shore, a small round creature with several tentacles emerged. Suzuki extended the pumice and the creature's skin instantly turned sharply white. He reflects that people know krakens only as huge horrors of the depths that drag ships to the bottom, but this tiny creature looks completely harmless when interacting with the group. The creature's body begins to shimmer with a mesmerizing kaleidoscope of colors and patterns, and surprisingly, he finds watching it pleasant. Suddenly, one of the creature's tentacles shoots out sharply and tightly wraps around the frame of his glasses. The little kraken pulls the rope with amazing strength. Its skin turns bright yellow, and Suzuki, realizing that the creature wants that thing, struggles in panic and confusion not to lose his glasses. Recoiling in shock, he sees a giant kraken emerging from the surf, its massive bulging head looming over the group, and the enormous size of the creature makes the tiny little animal he just dealt with look small, and a wave of panic washes over him. He trembles, looking up at the giant. Terrible thoughts swarm in his head. Could this be the father of the smaller creature, and is it going to drag him into the depths in revenge for some imagined insult? Instead of attacking, the giant gently extends its thick tentacles and carefully lifts the small kraken from the shore, and with amazing tenderness places it on its massive head, a gesture that seems almost maternal. When the creature settled, its skin suddenly turned white, and he watched fascinated, realizing that these creatures communicate through the colors of their bodies. One of the lizard people noticed the change and remarked that this shade means refusal, apology, or something bad. The color changes again, this time to a soft yellowish glow as the kraken begins to submerge its lower tentacles. The lizard person continues explaining, detailing that hiding a leg beneath the surface is another form of denial that reinforces the message of the white skin. Turning back to his young companion, he asks what she thinks those changing colors mean, but she only looks silently, puzzled. Meanwhile, the lizard adds that if the kraken raised its legs high, it would be a signal to start any task that Leia has. A sudden thought strikes him. Looking at the young shapeshifter, he realizes she might not distinguish colors at all. Recalling her strange behavior yesterday, he wonders if her vision is limited, while the lizard person turns the question back to the group and asks what they want to start. It becomes clear that the krakens of this settlement are bilingual in their own way. They communicate in two completely different ways: bright color changes for the keen eye and broad, bodily gestures to convey meaning to shapeshifters whose eyes see only a narrow part of the color spectrum. Kraken are known for coming ashore to exchange gifts of the sea for rare or shining things. A huge creature seemingly enchanted by the compass on the young traveler's neck, it was attracted by the metallic shine. He watches mesmerized as Koshu enters into a silent conversation of colors with the beast, the crack on the skin glowing brightly yellow again. Despite the creature's desire, the traveler understands he cannot part with his indispensable tool, and the possible exchange dissolves. At this news, it turned pale and shone with a pearly hue, a gesture that Koshu took as a polite farewell, and as if saying, "Nice to meet you." As the massive creature retreats into the depths, it flickers a complex sequence of dark blue, green, yellow, and orange, making the group puzzle over the meaning of its last message. Trembling from the damp cold, they huddle around a small fire and decide that enough is enough for today. Switching to survival mode, they soon realized that building a proper shelter was easier said than done, especially due to Kiku's clumsy attempts, and Kaisho scolded his companion, saying that despite his confidence, the hut remained a pile of unfinished materials. Because none of them really knew how to build, the group hastily erected a crooked, flimsy shack, hoping it would suffice for the night. After a tangled exchange of words with Kiku, they found themselves camped inside the settlement. But all their efforts were in vain. As soon as they settled for the night, the entire structure suddenly collapsed right on top of them. They saw that only the roof survived. It turned into a temporary tent that barely shielded them from the biting coastal winds as they huddled together in the darkness. He lay awake under the ruins of their shelter, intently watching the distant horizon, noticing that the kraken, which he called Wet Legs, seemed to be sending light signals to the shore, and in the darkness, he clearly saw responses flickering from the land. The clock was approaching 2 in the night, the silence of the beach broken only by his thoughts, and he wondered whether to create a translation system by comparing these light patterns with the writing of the lizard folk. Surprisingly, the meaning of the kraken's glow seemed much more intuitive and understandable to him than the complex symbols of the lizard folk. On the morning of October 20, a pleasant aroma woke the traveler. Suzuki was already up and warmly greeted him while preparing everything needed. At first, he took the smell for hot metal or molten stones, but as his senses sharpened, he realized his mistake. He looked closer at the source and saw it was the same rock that the kraken held yesterday. Sasuke leaned in, intrigued by the strange object, and aloud guessed whether it was some kind of incense. Eventually, he recognized it as Wet Legs as rock, a strange find from the depths. The young man thoughtfully examined the find, recalling tales about a similar fragrance that was found on distant beaches, although he himself had never encountered it. Turning his gaze, he noticed the locals hurriedly dragging supplies into a large cave on the opposite side of the pier. The lizard folk marched decisively, their scaly silhouettes standing out against the shimmering water as they prepared for the change of season. He noticed that the smoke from the beach was rising thicker than yesterday, a clear sign that activity here had intensified. Learning that the lizard folk were building another dwelling, he decided to visit the cave himself, and soon it became clear. This community was adapting to the cold by relocating from summer places to these sheltered winter refuges. When they stepped inside, he was struck by the scale of the cave. Before him unfolded a branched network of numerous rooms carved into the stone, and he froze, noticing piles of bark and wondering could this part be a communal storeroom for the tribe. Deeper into the shadows, they suddenly found themselves before a sight that took his breath away, a slime of incredible size, much larger than any specimen he had ever encountered in his travels. Then he realized it was not water, and that the locals' intention to take him to a warm place had brought him right here. Looking down at the huge gelatinous creature, he asked if it was really possible to leave it in this chamber, somewhat worried about what awaited the ancient beings in the future. He stands before a huge, shimmering figure, no water, which thanks him for the long journey. The voice of the slime became rough and casual, a sharp contrast to how it spoke before. Surprised by this sudden shift, he asks Suzuki if she has some more relaxed way of speaking that he has not yet heard, and only then realizes that the slime is simply imitating the speech of the lizard folk who now care for him. The creature even offers them a blanket against the cold, and gently invites them to feel at home in its casing. Despite the hospitality, he tells Suzuki that it is time to return to the road. Although the cave was a reliable refuge, he was eagerly drawn to see more of the world before winter finally covered everything with snow. His determination wavered for a moment from a fierce rumbling in his stomach. Remembering that they had hurriedly arrived and missed breakfast, he realized, before moving on, he urgently needed to eat something. He steps onto the worn wooden pier over the gray sea. He recalls that last night they ate the last provisions. The empty, endless horizon offers them no immediate solution to their hunger. He clearly remembers the exchange between the lizard folk and the seed krakens. Confident that he can repeat the process, he decides to try to trade something for fish, although he still does not know exactly how to summon these creatures to the surface. To his relief, a moderately sized kraken surfaced not far from the pier. He prepared for delicate work and negotiations, deciding to offer a glass test tube in exchange for food, as the compass was too valuable to part with. Following local custom, he and Suzuki bowed deeply to the water creature. This gesture silently signifies that negotiations have officially begun. He smiles as he watches the huge creature extend 2 items: fresh fish and a heavy metal shackle. The choice is obvious to him, and he rejoices at the prospect of breakfast. Confident in his choice, he points directly at the fish, but the kraken remains motionless and does not react to the gesture at all, and doubt begins to haunt him whether the instructions are understood here at all, for the creature only emits a quiet rhythmic sound, from which it is hard to tell whether it is agreement or something entirely different. While he thoughtfully listens to the silence, Suzuki nervously fidgets nearby, clearly sensing his struggle. She wants to suggest something, but he quietly stops her, resolutely deciding to decipher this foreign etiquette himself. Deciding to change tactics, he physically moved away from the unwanted shackle and moved closer to the fish, hoping that if gestures do not help, proximity will make his intentions indisputable. While he was focused on trading, the smaller kraken from yesterday suddenly lunged forward. Its tentacles grabbed the hood and pulled sharply. He froze in horror, wondering if this aggression was the very response he was looking for, and at the same time realized that simply observing the lizard folk would not help him, as their customs were just as alien. That evening, the 2 travelers sat by the crackling fire. The morning tension melted into the quiet murmur of a successful exchange, and he admitted his early arrogance, considering body language universal, was a big mistake, but they still managed to trade excess meat for dried fish. He still reflects on that meeting and concludes that lowering the hand into the water means refusal, and Suzuki says that actually, to show interest, one must raise both hands high, and although he is confused, he is pleased that his clumsy attempts ultimately conveyed the correct signal. Looking into the flames, he quietly dreams that someday he will impress someone with his skills, and Suzuki only smiles and mocks the fact that his habit of grabbing what he wants resembles a curious child more than an experienced traveler. Akaba calls Suzuki when she suddenly freezes and looks into the distance. Recognition and delight are evident on her face. She swiftly runs to a group of werewolves, one of whom is holding a package, and Hakaba follows closely behind, realizing that they have finally found the person to whom the parcel must be delivered. Approaching the large werewolf, she gently nestled against his thick fur and emitted a satisfied sound. He stood patiently, accepting the greeting, while Hakaba stood aside, observing their closeness. He focusedly turns his gaze back to work and watches intently as the old werewolf scrapes a large cauldron. Hakaba asks if they always make salt, but the werewolf explains that the smoke on the beach was specifically for salt making, and that old man is Grandpa Suzuki. Interested in their methods, he asked if they plan to preserve anything in the salt. The wolfman explained that although they do not always need such a large quantity, their needs are quite significant now. The conversation changes when the werewolf says they need to talk to the so-called branch legs at the square. They are already preparing to leave. Akaba looks embarrassed by this name, and nearby rows of fish hang on ropes, strange evidence of their recent trade. As they approach the noisy square, he sees mountains of good salt, incense stones, and various supplies piled up and ready for transport. His eyes are drawn to the center of events, where a group has gathered and moves with some strange rhythm. He wonders aloud, is it a dance or a ritual celebration, and notices one special figure in the very heart of the movement. He notices something floating in the air, delicate white feathers, and when he raises his eyes, he is suddenly struck, a mysterious figure before Hima Harpy. The group sets out at noon, and unexpectedly the lizard people Kashu and Kiku join them. As they head north to a forest settlement rumored about, the young traveler notices mountains of provisions and wonders, is this just a trading mission, or are they relocating entirely? Above him, the harpy leads the way through dense thickets, her feathered body like a star standing out among those walking on the ground below. Watching her, he thoughtfully reflects on the strange name others have given her, kindbranch legs. He is surprised that a creature whose symbol is the grandeur of flight is named for its legs rather than its wings. This detail sharply highlights the chasm between their peoples. He hopes to ask her more, but she is high above, separated by the very air she commands and surrounded by her own. He wonders if the word wings in her language is reserved only for harpies, so foreigners better not use it. Eventually, the trees recede, and in their place rises a towering cliff dotted with caves, a true heart of the forest community. At the foot of the cliff, a chaotic crowd had gathered various creatures and piles of crates with provisions, and it became clear. For many, this road ends here because the vertical ascent is an insurmountable obstacle for those without wings. He was waiting for the noisy bazaar where things are sold individually, but instead he freezes. The entire hall is instantly cleared out in bulk. Such agility and order suggest that a well-established system of tribute or large-scale trade operates here. When finally the leading harpy descends to their level, he is pierced by a new realization. This place is not just a destination point, but a true center, yet what they actually do here remains a mystery as he watches the harpy prepare to speak. He recalled conflicting legends about harpies. Some depicted them as ugly, fiercely cruel monsters, while others as enchanting seductresses. The professor once pondered that these two completely different views probably came from two entirely different types of people who had previously encountered this race. Turning his attention to the present, the young traveler politely greeted, wondering if this creature even understood his words. In response, the harpy suddenly began fiercely beating her huge wings. A gust of wind and the sharp crack of feathers completely caught him by surprise. It burst out with a piercing, high-pitched scream echoing off the cliff. Frightened, he raised his hand in a hesitant wave, trying to understand if this was the same formal greeting as with the lizard folk they had met earlier. The situation instantly escalated. The feathered creature lunged forward, its beak clicking, wings striking him, and he jumped back in shock, shouting confusedly, trying to comprehend why the meeting had so quickly turned aggressive. Sharp pecks rained down on his head, accompanied by a chorus of piercing squeals crying out in pain. He shielded himself as best he could, desperately trying to understand what he might have done to provoke such rage in that harpy bastard. Turning his gaze to the young companion, he noticed she was trembling strangely hard. He begged her to say what had angered the creature, but she remained silent for a long time, her face unreadable amid the chaotic flapping. She finally spoke and explained that there was a fundamental misunderstanding in communication between them. Just as they could not reproduce the sound of footsteps on branches, harpies could not mimic their sounds, and to his great surprise, she added that the frantic pecking and chaotic wing flapping actually meant the harpy was happy. Although the physical affection hurt, he gritted his teeth and tried to accept it with dignity, yielding to the greeting while the harpy energetically welcomed him. He realized that in this strange land, joy is expressed by a flurry of feathers and sharp beaks, quite unlike the quiet acquaintances he was used to. He reflects on the biological differences that require such a unique way of communication. Harps have vocal organs completely different from those of werewolves or lizard folk, so their sound range is incompatible. Because of this, they rely on a complex sign language. When he understands that the recent attack was actually a joyful greeting, he is overwhelmed with a wave of relief. After this discovery, he decides to record everything for the future. But when he looks at the tangled diagrams of harpies' movements, the true complexity of their body language dawns on him and stuns him for a moment. He weighs, is careful observation better or hands-on practice? While Suzuki seems to have absorbed the language of jointed legs just by watching, theoretical diagrams seem extremely confusing to him, and he wonders why what should be intuitive is so hard to grasp. Determined to overcome the chasm between them, he decides to watch a live demonstration and closely observes how the harpy makes a series of lightning-fast movements, trying to catch the one sequence that means a friendly greeting. In a moment, he tries to repeat the gesture, but it turns out far from perfect. The harpy immediately interrupts and points out that he is missing several key movements and is bending incorrectly, while Suzuki stands aside and notices his struggle. This defeat strikes like thunder, finally realizes the biological chasm between them. Harpies, werewolves, and lizardfolk have dynamic, kinetic vision that far surpasses human sight, so what appears blurred and spotty to his eyes becomes a clear, detailed sequence to them, and the extreme complexity of this language turns out to be merely a matter of perception. He continues to struggle, although the task becomes increasingly difficult. He notices that each part of the body, head, hands, legs, adds meaning to a single phrase. A small group of curious spectators gathers around, finding his sincere attempts amusing. Suzuki, concerned about his condition, suggests taking a break, but he insists and does not give up. Despite doubts, he still works devotedly on the task, is tormented by the thought that clumsy and slow movements may never truly convey his intention to the branched legs, but he knows. As long as there is a partner leading him, he must not give up. He continues to struggle with the harpy's language, asks how to express agreement, and wonders if the bird creature even likes this exchange, and the harpy responds with a quick, complex series of wing and body movements that leave him confused. Seeing his confusion, the young she-wolf explains that to say yes to one of the branched legs, you need to perfectly mirror the movements they just made, and the very tension required to understand this makes him fall face first into the snow, and she sincerely feels this. She notices that this has become a common phenomenon. The intensity of exchanges between species often proves too strong for his human mind. While he lies powerless, the harpy takes off, her powerful wings lifting clouds of snow. Watching the creature disappear into the sky, he worries that its sudden fall might have offended someone, but the companion quickly waved it off. Communication simply exhausts him. He needs to rest and calm his mind. He lies on the cold ground and feels a strange calm because he understands. The people of this land are used to barriers of misunderstanding, and this patience seems to lift a heavy burden from his shoulders. Later, when they were having breakfast together, lizard people approached them and informed that the group would soon set out. Although he was still tired, he confirmed that they would join the expedition. Reviewing the professor's old notebook while they prepared to depart, he noticed a chilling detail on the map. The next destination, an unplanned turn in his journey, was marked with the ominous name Death Town. By October 25, the procession had significantly grown. Harpies at various stops along the way picked up more and more cargo, and their ranks constantly swelled as they crossed the expanses. During the journey, the young scientist studied his companions and noticed that their sign language originated from courtship rituals. He was especially fascinated by one harpy. Her name was conveyed through unique double head turns, a subtlety that captivated him but was difficult to convey. He thought reflectively, although they usually spoke among themselves with voices, deciphering their sounds was a real mystery. Might he be able to bridge this gap with a flute to speak with them directly? While he had a quick snack, a wolf girl approached him with burning curiosity. Did he really understand the language of branch legs? And she eagerly asked him to teach her everything he knew. She watched as he decided to demonstrate. He turned to one of the winged creatures and threw a simple greeting, and to his surprise, the harpy responded with a sharp, inquisitive chirp, as if acknowledging his attempt to communicate. Her admiring gaze fell on him, and she indicated that the connection was established. He froze, somewhat stunned, holding the bowl, and realized that his modest understanding might actually work. Despite this small victory, in the professor's old records, their goal loomed as a heavy burden. There was a described place where only foundations remained, an abandoned settlement ominously known as the City of Death or Dead City. The procession finally reached the outskirts of the ruins, the air buzzing with the chatter and cries of harpies, and they stepped into the empty remains of the town, not knowing whether people or some hidden secrets remained among the stones. He asked what this place was called, and the lizard replied simply, Death. The place where death lives, such a grim name that made Suzuki let out a long, loud howl. Observing how easily the inhabitants moved here, he realized with surprise. Living here was actually quite simple, and his surprise grew even more because this lively cooperation was the complete opposite of the professor's gloomy descriptions of the city with its ominous name. Soon the lizard folk announced that the work was completed. They stepped back and admired the sturdy structure they had built into the ancient stone walls, while he and Suzuki watched their coordinated work with interest. On closer inspection, he realizes these ruins were not simply neglected, they were carefully remodeled and adapted for modern use. It is a masterful solution. Grooves and posts driven into the ground hold wooden columns that seem to have grown together with the existing stone masonry. He watches as werewolves and lizard folk work side by side and thinks that this is not a permanent ruin at all, but a special camp for rapid deployment and withdrawal, using ancient foundations as a convenient base for their dwellings. This realization fills him with a sense of profound discovery. Perhaps he has experienced such circumstances and felt cultural nuances that even the professor never learned in all his years of study. Moving deeper into the crowded settlement, he observes how Suzuki curiously sniffs the air as they pass various inhabitants, and feels a surge of anticipation. It seems to him that this special place will offer many more opportunities to learn about the world beyond the professor's notes. He follows the tempting smell of roasted meat wafting through the noisy city square, where sacks are being carried and people bustle about. He arrived just at the moment when a giant piece of meat was pulled from a pit. He froze in amazement. What kind of creature could have provided such a prize? The meat is pale and light, looking extraordinarily tender and appetizing despite its mysterious origin. Nearby are undeniable signs of a scale of plates. Giant-sized bones lay next to the remains of pieces. He begins to think this is some kind of hunting festival, but when he turns to share the thought, he notices that Suzuki is no longer nearby. Suddenly finding himself alone in the thick of the crowd, he panics and fusses in search of his companions and even accidentally approaches a lizard, mistaking it for one of his guides. He suddenly realizes, without a familiar face, all lizard folk look strangely alike, and because of Sasuke's tiny stature, she is not visible among the towering inhabitants. His embarrassment deepens when a huge shaggy beast looms over him, and the heavy grunts and snorts of the creature leave him uncertain whether it is trying to communicate or simply announcing its presence. He froze when a huge shaggy beast loomed over him. Its hot breath and muffled growls echoed in the narrow passage, and the sudden return of the beast with a companion caught him off guard and made him wonder if he had just missed a rare chance to observe a creature resembling a minotaur. When the beast hissed gutturally and stomped heavily, he could not help but perceive these unfamiliar manifestations as clear hostility to his unprepared eyes. Every snort and shift of weight seemed like the beginning of a brutal fight. When the tension subsided and he found himself alone again, he sat down, curled up on the ground, and pondered the bitter truth of his situation. He had acted on the standard advice to stay put if lost, but realized that his biggest mistake was allowing himself to get so deeply lost in this strange place. Seeking even a drop of help, he turned to the little creature he was carrying, but his pleas for translation were broken by stubborn silence. This annoyed him because he knew she spoke many languages, yet at this critical moment she chose to remain mute. Desperately trying to find his guides, he rushed to a group of large furry figures, hoping they were his companions, but the dense crowd almost immediately swallowed them, leaving him grasping at shadows as they disappeared from sight. He stood, sniffing the air and feeling loneliness grow as if all the town's inhabitants were deliberately avoiding him. When despair began to overwhelm him, a familiar voice called him, and he turned. Suzuki was walking toward him, accompanied by a small reptile. She explained with a joyful smile that they had actually never truly lost him. They had tracked his recognizable scent through the festival crowd, and turning to the white-horned creature nearby, gently asked if it had managed to eat during their brief separation. The sight of the beast left him speechless for a moment, his mind racing to understand who the little dragon Suzuki called their friend was. While he tried to make sense of meeting such a legend, the dragon simply chirped contentedly, clearly pleased with its recent meal. He froze, a tense smile fixed on his face as he tried to process what he had heard. When he hesitantly asked for an explanation, the cold truth struck. The little dragon with them was the offspring of the very creature they had recently eaten to survive. The little white dragon, called Goku by the locals, stands ready. Suzuki explains that in her language this name means big jaws, a perfectly fitting name for such a creature. It seems their roots are connected to the lizard people. Their pronunciation is strangely similar. The conversation darkened when it turned out that the father of this creature is soon to die. The traveler froze with a half piece of meat near his mouth. A wave of deep discomfort swept over him as he realized that the food he had just eaten came from the very father or mother they had just been talking about. In memory, the ancient records he once studied came alive. Aganthi painted a grim picture of these creatures and said they showed no sign of civilization or culture. Ancient descriptions depict them as miserable, heartless beasts who knew no sorrow and went so far as to devour the dead, regardless of whether they were friend or foe. Although these texts were written by enemies during the war and were probably biased, some observations turned out to be true. Their most noticeable feature: huge jaws grew throughout their long life. Walking along the path to the underground reservoir halfway up the city, the group encounters a giant sleeping figure. This cave has become a refuge for those who grew too large for the world above. The young man shuddered. A familiar slime was already sitting in the grotto. He timidly greeted the colossal dragon, father of his little companion, but in response heard a menacing belch that echoed loudly in the grotto. He recoils as a thunderous, hoarse roar bursts from the massive beast, the very force of which vibrates in the air of the cave. The young scientist strains to catch the strange noise, asks the little dragon what his father says, and sees that he doesn't understand either. The sound is so incredibly low that it feels more like a physical vibration than a voice, and human ears can hardly perceive it. He sighs, thinking how hard it is to catch such deep frequencies, and says that over time communicating will only get harder. Nearby, the wolf girl is shocked that he does not understand such an obvious message. The little dragon leans closer and gently asks how his parents are, while nearby the transparent slime stands completely still, making the traveler wonder what its mysterious role in this meeting is. He thoughtfully wonders if this slime serves as a bridge for communication and recalls how he previously asked the creature for help, but was met with silence. So the current behavior confuses him even more. Suddenly it dawned on him. He saw how the young dragon addressed the slime directly and asked if it felt the cold of the cave. It became clear that this was not just a tool, but a full-fledged interlocutor. He gazes at the huge, motionless figure of the ancient dragon and wonders whether the slimes are his companions or just silent listeners for those approaching the end of a long life. It pains him to realize the tragic fate of these old creatures. They lose movement and voice with age and eventually become cut off from the world. Delving into the cave, he finds the skeleton of another dragon, a depressing testament to the passage of time, where only skin and bones remain, and ahead the cavity opens wider, revealing a huge, silent graveyard of giants. He watches as the lizard folk get to work and dump materials into a huge, steaming cauldron, while high above the slimes watch their jelly-like bodies sway unsteadily as they fall down to join the others. Moving through the lively area, he comes across those huge shaggy bees he saw earlier and notices how the locals sprinkle lime and salt on the workplace, disinfect it, and treat thick hides, all done methodically, almost like in a factory. While the work continued, the question that had long weighed on his soul finally burst out, and he asked the young dragon if he felt offense or sadness seeing his father being dismembered and consumed. The dragon simply bowed his head for him. This thought was completely foreign. Nearby, the lizard-like beings picked up the conversation. They say they would even be glad if after death the same was done to them, and Suzuki looks with wide, curious eyes. For them, this is not humiliation, but the last, meaningful contribution. He cannot get rid of the thought: do the inhabitants of this deep world believe in some religion or a good place waiting for them when their bodies disappear, and is the way there to be eaten? But his question only adds more astonishment. The young dragon clarifies the situation. He says that the departure of the parents was expected, and this process ensures that the remains are used before the heat can decompose them. It is a matter of practical necessity and respect for the circle of life. When night falls, the air changes. A huge bonfire is lit in the center of the square, and while waiting for the communal stew, he watches as various tools and rags are thrown into the boiling cauldron instead of meat. The gathering turned into a surreal mix of banquet and funeral rite. Different races, werecats and lamia, seemed frozen, listening as the speaker retold the life of the deceased, and to the familiar sounds of the instrument played by the werewolf. He carefully notes vocal ranges and crowd behavior, trying to decipher the meaning of this strange, solemn farewell. He stood before the lizard folk and tried to explain his customs. Although he admitted that eating the dead in their culture is a sign of deep respect, he honestly confessed that he simply could not do the same, and this admission stunned his companions. Their jaws dropped in shock. Seeking the golden mean, he tried to explain what burial is, but his words only deepened their confusion. They asked if the earth really devours bodies, could not comprehend the custom when good people of his land do not touch the remains, and his attempt to bridge the cultural gap slid into a strange, unwanted direction. While he observed their reactions, the young she-wolf raised her eyes and thoughtfully searched where she fit into this strange philosophy. He thought that the lizard folk seemed to take his explanation as a simple cultural difference, but the girl's curiosity remained peach-colored. She suddenly asked a too direct, shocking question whether he would eat her if she died. He, embarrassed, instantly reassured her, assuring that no, and explained that his reasons were the same regardless of who it would be. Instead of calming down, the girl began to emit a low, rhythmic growl. Irritation burst from her tiny body, and he just stood puzzled, not understanding what he could have said to cause such an instinctive reaction. She sharply snorted, turned away, and walked off, not even looking in his direction. He turned to the lizard folk and asked if they were offended too, but they seemed to understand that her anger was from youth and ignorance. She remained aside, and the lizard folk, though different from him, still understood his gaze. However, they pointed out a simple thing. They were adults, and she was still very small, and she reacted like a child who felt rejected because of the refusal to include her in his life as her culture demanded. They watched as she curled up into a ball and fell soundly asleep, and it was then that the burden of cultural difference fell on him. He realized that for her, his refusal was not about morality, but about a connection she was still too young to understand otherwise. They stood side by side in the evening silence, the tension from their recent misunderstanding still heavy in the air. He looked down at the little girl and realized that his words had turned out heavier than he wanted. She suddenly jumped back, her voice sharply cut off by a stubborn refusal that echoed through the camp. He only looked slightly puzzled as she rushed away, and her laughter floated behind like a mischievous breeze after he jokingly said she needed to wash herself. Later that night, he sat leaning against a stone wall, the flickering light of the campfire nearby illuminating the pages of the professor's old diary. Beside him, the girl finally fell from exhaustion, her steady breathing the only sound in the silence, and he realized that the professor had also shared his shock over the local customs. He looked down at her sleeping figure, and his thoughts again returned to the lizard folk and that deep chasm between their cultures. Suddenly it became clear that what he considered understanding was only his own perspective, and this discovery made the path ahead much steeper. A star shone brightly above the ruined stone ruins, casting long shadows over the desolate area. He raised his eyes to the endless distance, gathering determination step by step to build a bridge between his world and theirs. At 2 o'clock in the night of October 26, the city of death sank into a deep, restless sleep. The fires burned down to glowing embers, and the ruins fell into absolute silence while he finally prepared to rest. He recalled the stories of the previous adherent who insisted one must appear completely harmless to the inhabitants of this land. A great gray wolf watched from afar, its gaze said nothing but was calm. Following those ancient instructions, he carefully laid out his belongings, his backpack, and even his weapons were pushed aside. He removed his armor and dressed simply, hoping to show everyone who found him that he came in peace. He realized that they had surrounded him and were watching from a distance with the same cautious curiosity as he himself had. To show that he posed no threat, he lay down on the grass, spread his arms and legs, and exposed his belly as a sign of complete submission. This frank vulnerability worked. The creatures approached, sniffed, and licked him, which was a sign of acceptance, but they took away his bladed weapons. Recalling the professor's notes, he suddenly understood that these creatures lived in the ruins of an old outpost, so he pitched a tent nearby to settle here for some time. In the cramped shelter, one of the werewolves joined him, and his presence was strangely calm, completely without the aggression he had initially feared so much. He was shown hospitality. A young pack member brought a dish, the preparation of which unexpectedly resembled human cuisine, hinting at a shared cultural threat. Even after the meal, the same werewolf remained in the tent, his large dark eye watching his every move, and they began a cautious, hesitant game, one step forward, one step back. Impressed by the intelligence shining in the creature's beautiful eyes, he decided to begin the difficult path, learning their language through this single, unexpected connection. He bent over, pressing his belly. The effects of that food took their toll. No matter how much he believed in his endurance, the strange tastes of the werewolf's cuisine proved too much for his stomach, and he realized. In this land, survival depended not only on strength but also on an iron stomach and complete indifference to taste. He woke up from the piercing October cold. The early light barely penetrated the shelter as the day was beginning. Rising, he noticed that his companion nearby was trembling, still sound asleep. The camp was strangely quiet, and he realized that their lizard folk had already gone to their morning duties, leaving the place oddly dark. His gaze slid to the entrance, and on the threshold stood a huge, shaggy figure, blocking the light and looming over the doorway. The sight of the great beast filled him with sharp anxiety, and he couldn't help but wonder if the beast had deliberately sought him out in this morning silence. He quickly calmed down and thought that most of the local creatures were indifferent until he approached them, but this one, on the contrary, patiently waited for him to come to his senses, so it clearly did not want harm to them. Watching the creature, he pondered, is this restless curiosity inherent to its entire species, or is this particular specimen just an exception? The beast crept closer, its large nose twitching, and it began sniffing the contents of his backpack with inquisitive, rhythmic sniffs. It loomed over him, its heavy steps trembled the ground. He realized that these rhythmic beats might be a way of communication and decided to observe the creature's behavior more closely to decipher their meaning. He carefully watches as the huge creature resorts to a new tactic, vigorously shaking its head and clicking its teeth, producing sharp, rhythmic clicks, a noticeable departure from its previous behavior, and it seems to be deliberately trying to establish contact. When the beast added heavy thuds to its repertoire, he began to guess that it might be some complex mixed language. He recalled how the previous night he rummaged through the professor's large notes and found no mention of such creatures, and this only sharpened the mystery of their origin. Suddenly the creature emits a sharp shshsh and he freezes in surprise. Nearby Suzuki stirs, her attention also caught by the unexpected sound, and tension in the camp rises sharply. The beast raises a thick finger to its snout and shshshs again with obvious intent. He looks, unable to believe his eyes. The creature is truly trying to find a common language. It continues to echo back with various sounds from quiet hisses to deep, resonant lows, and he wonders if it is a multilingual creature trying different sound combinations in search of an answer. When the beast tries to pronounce a familiar greeting and a few more melodic sounds, everything becomes clear. It is looking for a language someone will understand. He ironically notes that although the creature seems to know many languages, the werewolf language is clearly not among them. Relief washed over him when Koshu and Kiku returned to the camp, complaining about the biting cold. They arrived just in time, and he hopes their special perspective will help establish a connection with the furry guest. The lizard people approach, and the beast greets them with a series of snorts and quiet, deep grumbles. He watches this meeting closely, hoping that this new detail will finally reveal the secrets of the creature's message. He observes how two lizard-like beings, Koshu and Kiku, respond by naming themselves to the furry beast, and the animal emits a series of sharp, rhythmic teeth clicks, the sound cutting through the cold air. He perceives this as a specific signal, as if the beast is declaring itself the main voice of its pack, and he wonders whether Minotaur is its real name or just a label, noting that the introduction of a brother or sister triggered this clear response. He was stunned by the sudden physical intensity of their negotiations. Three creatures exploded into a cacophony of knocks and shouts, as if refining a common language, using beats as words. He sees that they have finally chosen a common spoken language, but to his ears it is still foreign. It seems to consist of those guttural, strange sounds he heard in werewolves, thereby building a bridge between their different species. He returned to Suzuki, hoping she could decipher these sounds, and felt relief finally communication was possible, but she just shook her head, as confused by this new language as he was. They intently pronounce complex chains of sounds, and the conversation between the pair of reptiles and the furry giant grows deeper, their faces remaining serious as they cautiously navigate the nuances of this temporary linguistic bridge. He watches and anxiety grows. The atmosphere suddenly tenses, all three begin raising their voices in a fierce quarrel, and he understands not a word and feels completely powerless, unable to intervene or calm the situation. He froze in confusion as the tension abruptly changed. The bison monster stuck out its tongue during the conversation, and he could not tell whether it was a serious insult or just a strange linguistic trick of the language they had just invented. He froze in stunned silence, watching as the aggressive demonstrations between the shaggy beast and the lizardman suddenly ceased, and they so unexpectedly turned away from each other that the air thickened with unanswered questions. The transition was abrupt. A moment ago they were at each other's throats, and the next they had switched partners and spoke as if no hostility existed, casually discussing the coming winter and buying meat, and the young teacher wondered in surprise if the fight had even happened. Although he felt it might be intrusive, he couldn't resist asking what had caused such a heated argument. The lizard answered with sincere surprise on his face and explained that he was not angry at all, it just came by and threw out a word that means nothing in human language. The young she-wolf intervened, trying to overcome the language barrier, and explained that the sound meant mixing, her large, innocent eyes searching for an answer on his face, hoping that this simple translation would clarify the complex social dance they had just witnessed. He thoughtfully rubbed his chin and asked if mixing for them was a way to name a quarrel. Suzuki tilted her head, her expression reflecting his confusion, as if the very idea of a dispute was foreign and incomprehensible to her. It became clear that they were guided by completely different concepts. For a human, the word argument carries a heavy connotation of confrontation and hostility, while for the monster the concept of mixing seemed devoid of that aggression, and this awakened his investigative interest. She explained again, in is a mix of cannot and bork is a mix of can, and he finally realized the phrase take bork and bork it turned out to be not just noise but an exact marker of how they interact. It became clear that between their cultures there was a deep open chasm in how they understood conflicts. While Suzuki struggled to find words to explain the nuances, the monsters behind relentlessly conducted their rhythmic, percussive dialogue and did not notice the language barriers their human companion was trying to overcome. He watched as Suzuki stepped forward to bridge the gap between them. Her appearance barely shifted the frozen conversation, and the tension after the previous clash began to subside as the group found common ground and was able to continue exchanging words. She looked puzzled, and in a moment the young she-wolf and her small companion settled into the thick, shaggy fur on the beast's belly, seeking warmth. It was noted that they had somehow primitively communicated using the harpy's sign language, an additional means of communication that served as a bridge between all the different species. They headed north, and the path turned out to be exactly what he had planned. He asked to walk alongside the huge minotaur and two lizard men who were heading to the settlement of Utatsu, and so this strange company relentlessly moved through the snowy expanses. They paused to say goodbye to the little dragon Goku before the final departure, and the creature tore out words in short phrases about its parent in a dead end, a turn that made him freeze until the tiny bees confirmed that it was about a transparent slime known as no water. Eventually, they left the town of Death shortly after 10 in the morning on October 29. Suzuki, comfortably settled on the broad back of the Minotaur, thought about the dragon's words and wondered if Dead End was the name dragons gave to slimes, because these gelatinous creatures stay close to them in their final days. It was early November, and the path north of the town of Death was difficult. Cold fog clung to the travelers and drained their strength as they struggled up the treacherous steep slope. The further they went, the more clearly he felt the werewolf's language changing. They began to speak the old, oral form of their language, which he had not encountered before. Feeling fatigue in the group, the young she-wolf suggested stopping to rest. He gladly agreed, as he himself was already confused by the constant changes in their group's dialects. The attempt to quickly set up camp instantly turned into chaos. He vainly tried to understand the growling instructions of the lizardmen about digging and gathering firewood, and for this he received a sharp rebuke for alleged incompetence. He quickly realized the lizard's temper flared from exhaustion, and when the inevitable quarrel surfaced, everything happening under protection suddenly froze. Fortunately, they came across a huge fallen tree that provided natural shelter, and while the she-wolf led them to it, he noticed that another lizard was also starting to break down from fatigue. He noticed it more and more. The more exhausted his companions became, the more often they reverted to the language of their ancestors. Even more troubling was that the shaggy beast also adopted this ancient language. When the beast looked him in the eyes and spoke about food, the man simply froze in shock. He sighed with relief when the she-wolf explained the beast's intentions. What he feared, that he would be eaten, turned out to be just a simple invitation to gather plants together. He recalled the professor's lectures about the intricacies of ancient tone. The meaning of a word could completely change depending on the pitch. A falling tone meant distancing, and a rising tone meant approaching. He enthusiastically explained that this language was deeply tied to directions and the listener's point of reference, and that the system itself probably grew out of how these creatures perceive the world through sound. Turning to the present, the young man accepted the invitation, although he was told not to overexert himself, and he realized that to master these linguistic nuances, he would have to observe carefully on his own. The group set off into the dense, snow-dusted forest to begin the search. Since they left the town Death, searching for and gathering food in the wild had become a frequent and forced task for them. While they worked, he noticed that both werewolves and lizard folk ate different greens, but he remained cautious. What was safe for one could be poison for another. A hairy beast named Mal began grazing on a small patch of leaves, and this instantly caught the young man's attention. He watched closely as the creature made sounds while eating, noticed a clear rise in tone, and understood that this intonation turned the basic word eat into a statement that the plant was safe to consume. He listened attentively as the furry beast emitted a low, melodic purring, seemingly just eat, but the tone changed the meaning, and Suzuki explained that it actually meant eat later, and now it was more important to continue gathering supplies. Digesting this discovery, he suddenly realized with amazement how intricate the monster's grammar was. He concluded that the concept of distancing from the action was directly tied to the verb's tense, but he could not grasp how could he distinguish such subtle differences in pitch at all. The young she-wolf confirmed his guess, saying that now their attention was fully focused on the plants they had started collecting, and her wide-open eyes and dry, restrained explanation somewhat confused him about the vast depth of the linguistic journey ahead. The plan was ready, and the group struggled through the deep snow of the pass, led ahead by a massive bison monster, its heavy steps paving the way through the frozen wasteland as they searched for a place to rest. After a long trek, they finally set up camp, where the lizard folk joined them again. Although lighting a fire with wet wood was difficult, the warmth of the food and the group's safety returned their conversations to a familiar, relaxed rhythm, which greatly eased him as a scientist. While they rested, he recalled that tonal phrase which earlier sounded like an insult. When he asked what it meant, the lizard folk and Suzuki exchanged uncertain glances and refused to translate the word without saying why. That night the sleep was far from peaceful. He tossed under heavy hides and thought that at such altitudes bright, angry dreams happened often, but this nightmare felt different. The hostility in it was directed straight at him. In the depths of sleep, he once again experiences the biting criticism of his comrades from the human world. Before his eyes appears the professor in the lecture hall, disdainfully asserting that monsters lack the intelligence for complex language. This memory haunts his subconscious even here, in the wild nature. He remembered how the professor, after that incident, pretended that everything was as before, but deliberately fell silent about that ancient werewolf they once talked about. Shaking off the remnants of sleep, he realized that Mao had already woken up the large animal quietly and attentively watched him in the dim light of the camp. The scientist tried to build a bridge between them, testing his theories about tone changes, and the beast responded by directing a sound at him, in which there was clearly felt either an invitation or an acknowledgement of his presence. Seeing the man's hesitation, the shaggy creature shifted its massive weight, freeing a place beside it, a silent offer which he accepted with a quiet "thank you," settling in the den. Then it poured out something like a passionate speech. Its deep voice thundered with complex sounds hinting at a future conflict, but the linguist could not grasp the exact meaning of the words. Despite the monster becoming increasingly excited and its loud panting breaking the rhythmic chanting, he felt a strange calm. The creature's sincerity reminded him of the mentor's nightly academic murmurs. The peaceful moment was suddenly disturbed by a stranger, a tall, reptile-like figure in a heavy cloak. He introduced himself as Eggy and warned that it was too damp here for rest. The newcomer said that others like him camped nearby and offered a better place. The group was left guessing whether it was a name or a title for his strange kind. He listens as Suzuki cheerfully introduces herself, her tail wagging, full of youthful energy, and in his hoarse, broken speech, the lizard-like guide recalls goblins in the forest and repeats that word again, as if it means more than just a name. The guide leads the way through the snow-covered forest, moving with a steady, purposeful gait, and the rest of the group follows closely behind. Hakaba watches from the rear with a quiet pensiveness on his face, trying to decipher the stranger's mysterious words about the place they are being led to. Soon they come out onto a clearing where several low shelters are nestled into the slope, neatly woven from branches, and the man points to the camp and says that his companion is waiting there, and it is clear that they know how to craft dwellings better than one might expect in such a wild place. Suddenly, a huge griffin let out a piercing cry, descending low, and its powerful wings stirred the cold air. When the beast landed, the guide explained that this creature too was leaving Hakaba in complete shock, and Suzuki begins to realize that this word signifies their shared identity, regardless of species. The group finally settles down for the long-awaited rest. One of the shaggy beasts groaned in pain, but Suzuki quickly offered soothing medicine and explained that it would help with headaches. The traveler noticed that fatigue had finally caught up with every one of the creatures they had encountered. She notices the reptilian Ahu and, with a bright smile, introduces herself. It turns out this group was strangely skilled in the healing arts. They diligently cared for the tired, shaggy beasts among them. He observes their interaction, a swarm of questions about local names buzzing in his head, and suddenly it dawns on him. In this forest, the word EU is a broad label, possibly even the same as what he knows as goblins or some mixture of races. Suddenly, a rustle in the nearby bushes caught everyone's attention. Another large, gloomy creature emerged from among the trees. The lizard-like Ahu warmly greets the creature, calling it a comrade, while the traveler just looks confused, trying to reconcile their vastly different appearances in his mind, even though both call themselves the same. Finally, they sit down to eat what the hosts provide, large pale larvae. Although the food was strange, the traveler surprisingly enjoyed it, and he noticed how quickly Suzuki had bonded with the new companions. Suddenly, she breaks the silence with a shocking confession. She had always harbored a desire to become a father, and the traveler froze speechless, his face becoming a mask of complete embarrassment at such an unexpected turn in the conversation. The girl continues her strange logic, saying that since that shaggy beast was already a father, she would simply become an ehu. The traveler finally loses patience and bursts out that her words make no sense at all, while the rest of the group looks puzzled. He persistently tries to clarify everything, says his name is Hakaba and he is not a professor at all, but Suzuki seems convinced that he is merely a subordinate of the senior scientist and simply does not listen to his explanations. He protests, but she looks at him wide-eyed and sincerely insists that he is her dad. He is completely confused and again says he is not her father, but she stands her ground, strangely insisting that she already knows the truth. This confusion makes him think about the connection with the professor. They are both men of their word, linguists at heart. While a nearby shaggy beast rhythmically clicks, he realizes that Suzuki also calls that creature dad, and this further confuses her understanding of that word. After a short rest, the group begins to help their hosts with daily tasks, combing the slope in search of certain plants and stones, and he suddenly realizes that he and these creatures are essentially working on the same task, and their methodical gathering is routine work. While they work, the young she-wolf impatiently asks for some of the found stones, but Ekyu decisively refuses her. The conversation is brief, and the group continues to drag large containers with collected materials back to the camp. His attention was drawn to strange wooden constructions attached to the limbs of Ekyu. They call them branched legs, and explain that these devices are not just tools, but vital substitutes for their natural standing, woven directly into their bodies. One of the creatures noted that such devices are usually intended for the elders of their kind, and this discovery triggered in him a memory of the professor's detailed diagrams of Harpy language and how leg position matters in their complex communication. He picks up one of the collected stones and, holding his breath, examines it carefully. A transparent crystal with a slight cloudiness inside, like golden needles. He thinks about the deeper meaning of these stones and strives to understand which of their features matters to EUC. He stood together with Suzuki and their shaggy companion Mao when the elder Ehio entrusted them with a task and simply said, "Take care of it." The young man felt a familiar wave of uncertainty. Again, he was given a task without being told the most important details. He looked at the pile of stones and wondered whether they needed to be moved, sorted, or if it was something entirely different. As he pondered their next step, he noticed the large creature Mao watching him without blinking, with an expectant gaze. He felt a bit awkward being on the other side of the interaction. The creature was silent, and its imitative behavior unpleasantly reminded him of his own attempts to fit in. Turning his attention back to the task, he looked closely at the place where several parchments with bright green signs were laid out near a pile of small stones, and wondered if these were their instructions, since the symbols on the sheet seemed to correspond to the very arrangement of the stones. Next to him, Suzuki leaned closer, her eyes wide open from a combination of sharp focus and wild curiosity as she examined the scattered pebbles. Suddenly she began to behave strangely. Her small hands lifted stones and dropped them, and they clattered in an apparently chaotic rhythm. He stood in silence, stunned, and his mind feverishly searched for at least some order in this seemingly utterly senseless spectacle of movement and sound. The young she-wolf shouted to him and offered to help distribute the stones while she and her brother or sister worked together, grabbing handfuls of smooth stones, staring at them for a moment and throwing a few back onto the ground, movements quick and purposeful, though there was little logic in it. She and her brother-sister continued working, and he watched attentively, trying to decipher their crazy method. It seemed they compared each stone with the green symbols on the parchment, but ultimately returned the stones back to the pile. This contradiction confused him even more. His brow furrowed as he tried to comprehend a process that seemed to cancel itself out. Soon Mao joined them, and his presence only further confused the boy. The beast began methodically laying stones in a row next to what Sasuke had already arranged, and he just clutched his head in despair because he realized that the logic of this world and this task was completely beyond his understanding. The lizard-like stranger pointed to the ground and explained that the first task, sorting the stones, was already done, and this puzzled the young traveler, because he saw no noticeable difference between the stones they had chosen and those left behind, and now doubted the very essence of their work. He stood and watched as the others piled stones into separate heaps, the rhythmic clinking of stones filling the air. Suddenly he was enlightened. As he gazed at those arrangements, his eyes widened in surprise. Unlike his cold, analytical approach, creatures like slime and werewolves spoke only vaguely, many or few. It became clear that the inhabitants of this world had no usual numbers and instead relied on approximate expressions to explain daily how much of what there was. Despite this, the piles themselves told an exact story. Each group had gathered almost the same total. He realized that his companions did not count in the usual way. They judged progress by the size and appearance of the piles, and the color and volume of the stones served as their main guide. This is how they communicated without numbers. Testing this theory, he laid stones into certain shapes and thereby confirmed that they perceived numbers as spatial patterns. When the sun began to set, the reptile leader admitted, although the quantities were not exactly equal, there was enough work, and he sincerely thanked them, noting that the travelers' helpers greatly helped finish the task before nightfall, a successful conclusion to their labor. He quietly watches as supplies are tied up and realizes everything is much simpler than he imagined. When the group prepares to depart, he is asked to rest, but his thoughts do not calm. He reviews what he saw during the day and marvels at the strange harmony of their actions. When night falls, he sees the camp like a hive that does not quiet down. Young werewolves unexpectedly eagerly help Ehyu. Their energy does not fade even despite the late hour, and watching how they work with such dedication, he sighs. Another sleepless night awaits him as he continues his training. While others are busy, his thoughts return to Sasuke's strange linguistic mistake. He wonders why she, not being a linguist, equated the human word father, and guesses what exact meeting or misunderstanding caused such a unique confusion in her young mind. This makes him think more deeply about the structure of the werewolf pack. Here, the titles of parents are not about blood, but about shared responsibility. In their language, any adult is called father or mother, because the whole group together raises and protects the youth, creating a bond that goes beyond blood. Looking at the young girl, he catches himself thinking about his mentor and the notes left after him, and wonders whether it was difficult for the professor to maintain icy academic rationality when he himself took on the role of a father, or perhaps these two roles eventually merged into one. He watches as the tension subsides and the werewolves celebrate joyfully. They have finally obtained those stones for which they fought so long. He sees their joy and understands. These stones are not always about old age, but rather about status and a sense of belonging in their circle. Under the starry sky, the group gathered near the shelter. The EU were preparing for a night raid, their cloaks rustling in the cool night air as they organized their supplies. He looked at them confused and asked what was happening, while one of the reptiles adjusted the equipment. That creature responded with a series of clicks and rustles, signaling that the mission was starting but explaining almost nothing. Chief Ehyo sternly warned him, "If you are going to join, you must pull your weight." They decided to allow others, including the shaggy beast and the warrior lizardman, to continue resting, and nearby the young she-wolf was ordered to be silent, nodded, her small figure slightly trembling from the cold. When they set off, he noticed that Ehyo was carrying large vessels of water. One of them ordered him to step lightly walk so that the earth itself would not feel his presence. He looked down at his feet, felt the texture of the soil under his boots, and wondered why such caution was necessary. They walked into the darkness like a silent procession through wild terrain. The young girl thought that this was a hunt, although the nature of their prey remained a mystery to the traveler. Ehyo moved decisively, their senses catching the faintest signs of the environment as they tracked something invisible. Suddenly the group froze, and he looked at his companions. Although they showed no weapons, they radiated natural power and readiness, a strange sight, hunters without blades or bows, relying only on innate skills. His foot slipped on uneven ground, and one of the Ehyu sharply reprimanded him. When he regained balance, he thought whether their prey was hiding underground, and soon he learned a strange fact. The lower jaws of the lizard-like creatures were highly sensitive organs that detected the faintest vibrations of the soil. Ehyu warned him to stay behind, saying that in the pre-dawn shadows his clumsiness could betray the hunt. He did not object, only agreed, acknowledging his own lack of grace in this unfamiliar, darkened world, and watched as they silently continued their pursuit. He froze in amazement when a huge creature offered him to sit on its back, and despite the warning that the hunt was too dangerous for outsiders, he decided not to fall behind the griffin and accepted this unexpected invitation to come closer. Sitting on the back of the monster, he thinks about the gap between legend and reality. He does not need fame, but from the fact that he found himself on a creature from myths, his heart pounds, although he tries to remain calm. But the majestic image quickly fades. The griffin begins to sway, its legs tremble under the weight. The movements do not at all resemble the graceful flight from ancient tales, and he clings tightly to his life. This clumsy performance opened his eyes. These creatures were probably never made for the hell of battle. They were rather made as symbols of power for lavish parades. They were better suited for hauling supplies and covering with ceremonial fabrics than for quick tactical movements. After dismounting, he watches as Suzuki impatiently prepares for her turn. She almost vibrates with excitement, and he still reflects on the historical connection between his species and these feathered beasts, which seems much more pragmatic than the legend says. They soon catch up with the rest of the group, which suddenly froze in the snowy forest. Suzuki is glad about the progress but remains cautious, wondering if Ehiyu has finally found the prey they pursued through the cold. Instead, the hunters just stood still, intently watching the frozen ground, and to his surprise, they began methodically pouring water from their vessels onto the soil, not at all like any usual hunting method. Following them, he carefully examines a handful of dark, grainy substance from a pouch given to him. He is ordered to mix this mysterious substance with water, although he does not understand how this strange ritual will help them catch their quarry. He sprinkles the powder on the marked spot, and the others watch intently, holding their breath, waiting for the reaction to start. The reaction was instantaneous. A huge, segmented beast known as bark burst from the ground, and Suzuki opened her eyes wide, impressed by the incredible strength of the individuals of this region. She watches as Ehiyu explains how deadly their method is, comparing the suffocating effect of the powder to poisoning fish in a pond. He asks if they really hunt such formidable beasts, and the hunter replies that one must strike hard to quickly put an end to it. When the skirmish ended, they threw the heavy carcass on the griffin's back. Suzuki thinks that such creatures near her home would make her a valuable asset for any hunting party. While they work, he asks if they eat anything else besides these giant analysts, and EU answers instantly, almost too quickly for him to keep up, because they move with a predatory grace that reminds him of their nature. This observation raises for him the persistent question about the blurred boundaries of the afterlife. He understands that creatures like the barca are both wild game and domestic livestock. They are raised on farms for the survival of tribes. He asks aloud if it is possible to somehow communicate with these creatures, but the Ekiyu remain silent. Their sharp gaze makes him regret having asked at all, and he quickly apologizes, realizing that he may have crossed cultural boundaries. The hunter finally explains that it is the barkers who are chosen because their bodies remain firm and clean after death, unlike slimy creatures or ordinary game. When they prepare the meat, he is left to wonder by what rule this world decides who is a friend, who is a beast, and who is simply food. He swings the heavy hammer in rhythm, the blows echoing through the camp. Kakaba stands watching, mesmerized by the raw physical power behind each strike. This relentless knocking does not cease. The noise is so pervasive that it wakes Kashu and Fluffy Mao from sleep, while Hakaba silently watches and notices that Ehius's concentration has not wavered, though it is still early. Next to him, Suzuki is looking with wide-open eyes, anticipation bursting out, and she repeats the movements, while Ehiyu explains that the goal is to grind the ingredients so that they lose their distinct outlines and merge into a homogeneous mass, adding aromatic, finely chopped herbs for better flavor. She enthusiastically agrees, noting how delicious the mixture becomes when shaped and baked. Ehiyu adds a strict warning that a poorly mixed batch is unacceptable, and Hakaba takes this as a fundamental principle, as a matter of pride in their culinary tradition. As morning approached, he became increasingly confused by Ekiyu's mysterious way of speaking until he realized the creature was not choosing to be silent. It physically could not speak. When the meal ended, the group began to prepare to leave, and Ekiyu warned them to be cautious about the heights they would have to cross. By the 4th of November, the travelers had already received as gifts healing herbs and dried meat, and finally set off further. Ekiyu cannot explain the subtleties of his customs in words, so Hakaba remains pondering those unspeakable rules and unwritten agreements that connect the various inhabitants of this world. Hakaba reflects on the very nature of language, on how the simple "what is this?" becomes the basis for learning new words during lessons with Suzuki. He was suddenly enlightened about the use of demonstrative words to precisely indicate specific objects, although he admits that in such a changeable, confusing otherworld, this precision often slips away. He points to the horizon and asks his companions to look at the amazing sight. Suzuki, looking there, exclaims with surprise. On November 6, the group stood on a windy mountain ridge. Above the peaks arched a bright rainbow. The EU confirms that they are approaching the territory of branch legs, an important milestone in their exhausting journey. During a short break, she pressed against him, seeking comfort, and persistently demanded to be petted on the head. He noticed that her fur had become noticeably thicker, a natural adaptation to the piercing cold of the highlands. He glances down at his feet and sees that icy lace appears on the ground more and more often. The higher they climb, the denser it becomes. He counts every minute and insists they must reach the settlement of Utatsu before the winter snows close the path, and increasingly suspects that the thick white mist on the mountain slope is not just fog. The true nature of the fog is revealed when they come across huge clouds of steam bursting from beneath the ground. After reviewing the records, he explains that Utatsu is located in a volcanic zone, a warm geothermal haven where travelers gather to survive the icy season. He watches Suzuki jumping along a row of wooden planks over the steaming ground. She calls back to him with a cheerful smile, saying that the planks are pleasantly warm under her feet and provide a brief respite from the piercing cold. Looking around, he noticed thick fog rising from beneath the ground, a sharp contrast to the frozen landscape. The ground was a torn mixture of snow and volcanic stones, clearly indicating their proximity to the geothermal heart of the region. Upstream, the group finds the ruins of a small settlement nestled between cracks, the source of heat being a bubbling thermal spring. But when he touches the water, he instantly pulls back. It is murky, yellowish-brown, and too scalding for bathing. While they scour the abandoned settlement, Mur pulls a heavy rolled bundle from under the rubble, and it becomes clear that the shaggy beast once sought shelter here during a previous journey from the valley and left supplies. Using the remains of Mao's old tent, the companions quickly set up a temporary camp, the salvaged materials greatly easing the task. Ahiyu firmly secures the structure, while the others prepare for the night. While preparing the camp, Mao freezes, his gaze fixed on a pile of broken planks scattered on the ground. He is troubled and notices that these planks are not at all like those used to make the bridge over the hot springs, and the reason for their appearance remains a mystery. The giant creature intently watches a jagged piece of wood, its face unreadable but heavy with sudden quiet contemplation. Finally, he picks up a fragment of a broken board and shows it to his comrades. The discovery of these unusual materials among the ruins of the settlement cast a shadow of uncertainty over their resting place. He handed the young man a split piece of wood, and he looked at it in complete amazement, not understanding what to do with such a fragment. Without saying another word, the hairy beast turned around and headed into the snow which it longed for. Its heavy steps echoed with rhythmic clicking on the frozen ground. He insisted that he knew these lands well and could go alone, decisively refusing the traveler's accompaniment. At the same time, he said that it was more important for the companion to watch over the young she-wolf, and the traveler quietly accepted this responsibility, whispering, "Thank you." When the beast disappeared from sight, the traveler shifted his gaze to the various inhabitants of the settlement. Werewolves and lizard folk warmed themselves near the thermal baths, but his attention was caught by the Lemasi, a species he realized he had never truly spoken with. They seemed to be the most numerous in this strange, foggy place. He threw a friendly greeting as one of the scaly creatures slipped past, and he politely introduced himself, but she passed by without even glancing or giving the slightest sign of recognition, and he was left wondering whether they understood the language of werewolves or ordinary intonation at all. This had happened more than once. He stood for a moment, pondering the strange silence and the fact that the locals did not react at all. Even when the young she-wolf stepped forward and introduced herself with a bright, energetic exclamation, the snake woman did not react at all, and the traveler watched carefully and began to suspect that their silence was not so much a sign of cold rejection as a consequence of a deeper difference in how they communicate or perceive the world around them. He thought perhaps sound was not their main way of communication, like the barely noticeable signals of werewolves, and he realized that his words remained unheard, so he decided to try another approach, perhaps a language that did not require sound at all. He watched as Suzuki jumped back in fright. A sharp hiss passed through the air, and the Lamia's tail struck closer. The snake-like woman looked at them without blinking, her presence cold and threatening. Despite the hostile reception, he boldly approached the local werewolf and tried to speak, but the werewolf stood firm, fully focused on grinding materials in a stone mortar, and Suzuki barely found words. Only muffled, incomprehensible murmurs came from her lips. While the young beast girl rhythmically tapped on a neighboring stone, he stood nearby and felt anxiety slowly growing within him. He could not shake the thought that the settlement's inhabitants were deliberately pushing them away. His thoughts were interrupted when she pointed toward the distant horizon and said that Mao had been watching their every move since they arrived. Turning around, he realized that the departure of that hairy beast was not a complete abandonment, but perhaps a test of their intuition. He pulls out the worn board that was just handed to him, twists it in his hands, and suddenly understands. Its texture and the way it was given indicate that this is not just a scrap of wood, but an important clue to understanding this place. Testing the theory, he sharply clapped his hands, and the sudden sound cut through the village hum. The reaction was immediate. Nearby, Lamia jumped back with a defensive hiss, causing the frightened Suzuki to dart away in fear. While he contemplates their reaction, his thoughts involuntarily turn to other inhabitants. Above all, he is gnawed by the question of where those young werewolves, brothers and sisters, have gone. The settlement is strangely empty, familiar faces that were here before seem as if they never existed. The rhythmic tapping caught his hearing and drew his gaze to a nearby pair. He watches with admiration as a lamia and the lizard-like ehiu silently tap a complex code with their scales on the ground, the secret of their silence finally revealed. They communicate through vibrations and touch, not sound. While the group rested, the tail rhythmically tapped on the hard surface, and this sound echoed in the quiet air. It does not cease. The serpent-like creature coils next to the shaggy beast, and immediately the question arises: is a special platform needed for such communication to be heard? He watches the exchange with a puzzled expression, marveling at how they can even understand who is speaking to whom in this mute, rhythmic conversation. The confusion only grows as he imagines how they can distinguish the beginning of a message and understand who sent it amid the constant vibration. The young man froze in place, carefully noting the barely noticeable movements of the tail on the ground to better understand this phenomenon. He flips through the records and notices that these creatures do not make sounds, and their internal methods of communication remain a mystery to outsiders, although they are called by different names, for example, slitherjaws. A sudden breakthrough, he realizes that the meaning is hidden in the very rhythm of the tapping, and by comparing these patterns with those created by other creatures, such as harpies, everything falls into place. Suddenly he sharply points into the distance and calls his companion. There unexpectedly appeared a harpy, but she barely sees what caught his attention. He, as if enchanted, watches how Suzuki imitates the movement, her eyes wide open with concentration as she recognizes the gesture for a walk. Shaking his head, he makes another movement and asks her to say how she sees it, but she admits she is not sure. He continues the exercise, rhythmically waving his hands, and this time she instantly recognizes another sign for go, so he begins to flap as if with wings to check if the meaning is preserved. The realization begins to take shape. The rises and falls of the harpy's neck repeat the tonal shifts of the ancient language of werewolves, and the movements of her wings serve as the main verb to denote travel. Looking at the shaggy beast nearby, he wondered if the same linguistic patterns could apply to his slow, measured movements. Suddenly, the huge creature extends a paw. Its heavy, fluffy limb rests on his shoulder. This gesture catches him by surprise. When the beast exhales hot, rhythmic puffs right at him, he rushes into ever deeper academic reflections, whether these movements convey tense forms or grammatical voice, or if the harpy's language is much more multidimensional than he initially assumed. His thoughts are suddenly interrupted when the beast tosses him into the air, and the simple command makes it clear today's lesson is over. He moves so fast that it contradicts his massive, shaggy body, and the young scientist is left breathless and embarrassed by this sudden burst of agility. Arriving at the place, he gently sets the man on his feet, and the young she-wolf looks at the display of strength with wide, frightened eyes. As he heavily moves away into the distance, the scientist notices something strange on the ground, a flock of small, pale creatures scattering in the wake of his heavy steps. Realizing that this is a rare opportunity for field observations, he decides to follow the strange creatures, and his young companion enthusiastically agrees to join the pursuit. The trail led him to an open clearing where he approached a huge werewolf, extended a small sign of peace, and said he wanted to talk. He begins the interrogation, asking how long the pack has settled here, but the creature initially remains silent, pondering the question. Eventually, she says that they have been here since last winter, which prompts the scientist to delve into their history and daily life. Looking closer at the settlement, he notices that the locals have advanced tools and even considerable skills, so he asks for help to turn a heavy grindstone. She points to the heavy mechanism and asks for help to turn it. While the work proceeds, the rhythmic tapping of tools fills the air, living confirmation of the settlement's industriousness and the focus of its inhabitants. When the task is completed, the one who asked for help does not say a word of thanks, simply returns to work. Here reigns a culture of strict efficiency. Actions are the only currency, and polite words are discarded for the sake of progress. Observing this, the traveler understands. These people are the elite of craftsmen even among their own. Their level of mastery distinguishes them. Another worker silently gathers several processed stones and walks away, once again showing their silent coordination and strict determination. Nearby, a young she-wolf watches with wide shining eyes. Her hands busily mimic their movements, sorting wood scraps and scorched branches. She is fascinated by their skill and pays no attention to the complex language of the lamias, being fully immersed in the rhythm of work. He watches her and suddenly realizes, what at first seemed like coldness from the rest was actually just fierce dedication to their craft. She squats on the ground, surrounded by improvised tools, with a pure, joyful focus on her face as she tries to replicate the master's techniques. When the evening shadows stretched across the workshop, she had already made a stone knife by hand, a simple but functional tool, a clear proof of hours of silent observation and tireless work. Her efforts do not go unnoticed. A craftsman give her even more raw materials as a reward for her persistence, and nearby a serpentine figure rhythmically taps on a wooden board, a mysterious way of communication that remains a secret to observers but holds weight in this workshop. They continue to bring more and more supplies, and the travelers were increasingly amazed by their sudden generosity. In the middle of the exchange, a stern voice suddenly cut through, announcing that the work was insufficient and reminding everyone, "Only the best is valued in this settlement." After dinner, the shaggy beast Mao approaches the traveler and returns his diary along with a loose page that seems to have torn from the binding. He mutters a simple command quietly, pushes a few things toward him, and insists that he take them. He accepts the offering and raises them to his face to look at and smell. A faint, sharp scent reaches him like aged cheese, and he quietly wonders if this is a clumsy attempt and an apologetic gift from the beast. His thought is interrupted by a sudden burst of energy. A young wolf girl lunges forward, her nose trembling wildly. She has caught a scent. He tries to hold her back, asks her to calm down, and inquires what caused such a strong reaction. She ignores his pleas, completely absorbed by the gift. She begins to gnaw and sniff it wildly. He watches this with a mixture of surprise and a slight smile, the chaotic energy of the moment sharply contrasting with the quiet evening. Turning his attention back to the diary, he carefully examined the torn sheet of paper and wondered whether it tore because the beast tried to decipher its content, or if the creature was simply unaware of the meaning of the thing it held. When he looked closer at the parchment, unease began to grip him. Something about the texture or markings of this particular page felt completely different from the rest of the diary, and it awakened a new wave of curiosity and anxiety. Hakaba carefully examines the diary in his hands, recognizing the professor's distinctive handwriting, but quickly notices something strange: a loose sheet inside, clearly not from the original binding, densely filled with notes about the origin of certain borrowed words. He thinks about those who walked this path before him, feeling that his predecessors stumbled upon the same truths in roughly the same way, and suddenly he is overwhelmed by a heavy realization: soon he may have to make the same difficult choice. Turning to that mysterious insert, he confirms it is definitely connected to the professor's works, and while Suzuki and their shaggy companion eat nearby, the silence between them pains him. He so wants them to have a common language, to finally truly understand each other. The monsters they met yesterday have gathered together and are sharing flat, steaming cakes among themselves. Even the reserved lizard folk, usually gloomy, seem to find comfort in this simple, warm food and eat alongside the travelers. He hesitantly bit into the offered treat and discovered a spicy steamed dish made from ground moss and roots, whose taste was unexpectedly pleasant, and Suzuki was so delighted that she immediately asked to be taught these recipes. Suddenly, a huge furry beast nearby begins to make strange sounds and, surprisingly, utters an awkward but sincere "thank you," and the young man freezes in amazement, his eyes wide open as he tries to comprehend the beast's unexpected attempt to speak like a human. She watches with interest as the monsters start combining the food they gathered with the cooked meat given by the travelers. It is a quiet but important moment of cultural exchange. They find common ground simply through a shared meal. Looking around, he notices with a start that a large and diverse crowd of creatures has gathered in the shadows around them, and the sheer number of monsters quietly approaching to join their circle makes him wonder how long they had been standing there watching. He sat among those present, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and embarrassment. Everything was clear in his mind, but his heart was heavy, and nearby a reptile offered more food and simply nudged him. "Eat." Continuing to eat, he heard the monsters collectively declare that they were setting off to a certain but unclear place. He immediately burst out in protest, asking them to stay and demanding that they tell him exactly where they were heading. His anxiety was palpable. He sincerely admitted that he did not want to see them harmed, but the creatures remained resolute, insisting they would go, asking him not to stand in their way, although they remained silent about the destination itself. Defenk. Seeking clarity, he insisted they explain why they believed this journey would lead them to death. They answered simply, "The road ahead is treacherous and deadly," and as he swallowed their blunt words about the threat, it began to dawn on him how serious the danger was. They spoke about the road, how it was once good, and how they used to take care of it. He fell silent and listened carefully, wondering whether their strange way of speaking came from the place where they lived or from being close to the weakest. Changing the subject, they loudly boasted about their skills in crafting and repairing, recalling how they once skillfully used many tools until they lost them. He clearly froze at this sudden flow of detailed, though fragmented, memories of their former abilities. Suddenly, everyone spoke at once, filling the air with a clamor of voices as each monster repeated its story about work and losses. Stunned by the noise, he looked at the young she-wolf, who calmly explained that such a collective outburst of voices was a usual thing for them. He looked puzzled, and it became increasingly clear that each creature was just repeating the same phrases over and over. As they told about repairs they made and tools they dropped, he could not tear himself away from one obsessive question. What exactly did they mean by those places? He notices that something has changed in the monster's behavior. Its speech has become different. It falls silent, then again and again utters the same phrases, completely different from what had sounded before. This discovery forces him to understand that when they want answers, they present words as requests, just as a shaggy beast approaches and asks permission to clean up and leave. A sudden, sharp crack near the mechanism frightened the young she-wolf. Her ears twitched from the unexpected sound. When the group was preparing to set off, the monsters explained that breaking camp usually signals others to scatter, and he quietly acknowledged this, watching their preparations. The air quickly fills with a storm of voices. Creatures chatter, search for winter shelter, recall distant places like Wo-W and even Although, and from this chaos he understands that the path to Utatsu through the village of shaggy beasts is full of dangers. Although he warned strongly about the danger, the large animal still insisted on traveling, so it was sternly warned, better not to go. Turning his gaze to the document with the warning, he decides that he must examine its contents more closely and go to the monster's village himself. The decision was made. The group sets off on the road, the rhythmic sound of their steps echoes, and the snake woman and the shaggy beast lead into the unknown. He watches as the snake woman crawls ahead, her living body moving through the treacherously slippery rain-soaked ground, searching for a reliable passage for the group. Beneath their feet the earth crumbles and is uneven, scarred by recent heavy rains that made the mountain path extremely dangerous. He continues to follow her, questioning the nearby furry beast and wondering if this winding path leads directly to his ancestral home. The beast grunts negatively and explains that the plan was always to survey the area and weigh options before finally deciding where to settle. The conversation fell silent when they reached the ridge, and an astonishing view opened before them, a huge, strangely directed canyon cutting deep into the earth. The scale of this natural wonder took their breath away for a moment, and a quiet, admiring wow escaped into the cool mountain air. The group reaches a crossroads. The snake-like woman notices a traveler returning to the settlement, decides to join him and return home, parting from companions who continue on the path. After saying goodbye, the traveler and his shaggy beast moved on. They walked north for 2 days, keeping along the mountain ridge until November 10 arrived. Their movement slowed down before a wide, turbulent river on the outskirts of the Utatsu district, and they set up a temporary camp on its banks. The swift water became a formidable obstacle on the way. He watches as the lizard folk maneuver in the treacherous current. Despite the swiftness of the water, they seem to glide through it with a natural, honed ease that he could never achieve. Standing next to his massive companion and the local reptiles, he thinks about what to do next, and his hesitation sharply contrasts with their relaxed confidence in this place. He asks those big jaws why they haven't crossed yet, but instead of an answer, aggressive clicks and growls suddenly flare up between them, and he realizes that these internal quarrels might have caused their previous clash. But just as he noticed that they were too relaxed, one of the lizards brushed off his concern and simply said that they were waiting for the water to freeze, and this mysterious answer confused him even more. The lizard-like warrior calmly explains that the current rise in water is caused by a tributary flowing in upstream, and he patiently sits watching the stream, knowing that everything will change sooner or later. They watched as the riverbank slowly turned into an improvised camp. The water refused to give way, so many travelers resigned themselves to a long wait, and some even began building permanent shelters, preparing for the river to freeze. He carefully examined a handful of edible moss offered by one of the locals, considering all options. He was troubled by the realization that even his young companion was seriously considering the idea of staying for the whole winter. They had to decide: wait in place or find a way to cross further. Nearby, the shapeshifters had already adapted to the delay and skillfully pulled fish from the icy currents. Even the younger ones worked tirelessly, gathering every scrap of food they could find so the pack could survive the coming weeks. While others took care of urgent matters, the furry beast went to look for harpies, hoping that their view from above would reveal a hidden path or another road that those who walk on the ground had missed. He stared into the turbulent stream, thoughts racing one after another. The idea of just waiting seemed like defeat, so he began to wonder if they had the means to cross the chasm on their own, determined to help in any way he could. His attention was drawn to a working cat further down the shore who was already fiddling with a rope, and it seemed others had the same idea, trying to build their own bridge to bypass the flooded river. The mouse-like creature indifferently ignored his approach, fully immersed in securing the ropes. It was clear the locals were used to solving their problems on their own without outside interference. While the cat worked silently, a familiar small voice pulled him out of his reverie. His friend cheerfully ran up, eagerly wanting to help with his new project, and for a moment postponed gathering food to support his ambitious plan. She watches intently, holding her breath, while the young man explains his plan and gestures towards the gathered materials. He says that by tying the boards together, they will be able to build a sturdy structure bridge over the water. While the conversation continued, he thoughtfully glanced at the other travelers and thought, maybe they just prefer silence, but you really don't find out until you try to talk to them. She tilted her head with curiosity, as if pondering this thought. Beside it, a giant reptile steps with heavy rumbling. Mighty limbs carry it across the rocky ground. It approaches the water's edge, movements calm and confident. He closely observes the lizard-like creatures, noting with interest how on land they switch to walking on all fours, a practical adaptation to harsh conditions. Suddenly, a flock of small, round, fluffy creatures approaches, their numerous little eyes blinking with curiosity. They offer their help, admitting they were wrong to stay aside before, and he accepts their help with a surprised but grateful smile. When the new assistants gathered around, he began to show how to tie washed logs with vines, explaining that individual pieces were neither long nor thick on their own, so joining them was the only way to make a strong bridge. The little creatures eagerly set to work, but do so clumsily and chaotically. One proudly shows off its product, and he looks at them a bit puzzled by their unusual methods where they do not tie anything. Stopping for a moment and glancing further along the riverbank, he realized they were far from alone. Many other travelers were also working diligently, each trying to build their own improvised bridge across the current. He watches various groups scattered along the shore. Each puts effort into some makeshift crossing, and it seems to him a futile fuss, because if everyone united their efforts and built one strong crossing, the work would go much faster, but each group, it seems, stubbornly decides on its own, separately from one another. This lack of cooperation pushes him to a sudden realization. Since he left the first village, he has not met anyone who could be called a leader, and this thought clings to him as he looks at the bustling, fragmented scene around. Turning to his comrades, he tries to vividly explain the idea, saying that it would be useful to have someone who makes decisions for the group. The lizard folk wonder if he means someone who lives long in one place, and Suzuki does not know such a word at all. He persistently questions who decides the actions of adults in their society. They answer simply and directly. Adults decide for themselves, and he is left to struggle with the fundamental difference in their social structures. Trying another approach, he says that a leader is one who knows the way or goes ahead of everyone, but this only increases confusion, because the tone of his words does not bridge the cultural gap between them. Turning attention back to the matter, one of the lizards pointed to his progress in construction and, shuddering, noted that their design strangely resembles others he had seen, as if hinting at a common, possibly instinctive approach to the problem with. Suddenly, a loud splash. The lizard folk throw a huge boulder into the turbulent water and, tying thick ropes to it, make a rough but effective anchor that holds their bridge against the treacherous current. Seeing that the anchor holds firmly, the lizard-like workers grumble contentedly. The foundation is ready, and they prepare to continue working, confident in their solitary methods. They stood together, and the furry beast told about the harsh reality of their work. During bridge construction, a fall means becoming meat, a fate to be avoided. The small, fluffy assistant decisively intervened and promised that from tomorrow everyone would work together, and Hakaba only gasped in shock at such a mundane mention of a grim possibility. He listens as the beast plainly says that the previous worker fell, died, and was eaten. Hearing this, Suzuki raises his eyes to his teacher with burning determination and vows to protect him from such a fate. Hakaba, realizing the severity of life and death in this wild area, silently decides to be extremely careful not to end up on the menu during tomorrow's construction. The morning air bit sharply. Someone remarked on the cold, but the young she-wolf nearby was not cold at all. Their conversation was interrupted by a white working cat who visited again. Watching the newcomer, he understands this creature is used to much harsher conditions. Its scent and manners reveal that it comes from much colder regions than this place. He watches as the feline guest proves to be extremely affectionate, pressing against him and purring friendly, then turning attention to the girl and playfully licking her while they exchange greetings. By November 11, the group gathers on the riverbank, where the swift water has become even more turbulent and powerful than the day before. They switch to constructing a sturdy wooden platform, carefully tied with thick ropes to withstand the elements. He took the helm in his hands, ordered the lizard folk to gather more supplies, and insisted strongly. The structure must be even stronger than previous attempts. Meanwhile, a young girl asks how she can best help when the work is divided between rope weaving and deck construction. He takes a tool from her. The work progresses, and both of them, burning with the desire to help, work side by side under the open sky. He froze, looking puzzled, and asked the worker hat why the rope weaving was not progressing at all, but the hat stubbornly shook its head in response, while another small creature nearby was already engaged in that task. He watches as a small worker cat and a huge hairy beast try to communicate with simple gestures and repeated phrases. The worker cat persistently points to the thick rope, trying to reach a common understanding of the task. Observing the conversation, he suddenly realizes this word carries different weight depending on who is speaking. For the worker helmet, it means a rope across the river, but for the lizard folk, it is part of the bridge's very structure. He flips through notes and immerses himself in the subtleties of the wolf language, where demonstrative words are fluid and their meaning changes depending on the speaker's proximity and what both know about the environment. For example, by the scent of what is currently at hand. Turning his attention back to the lizards, he discusses how wide the structure should be. The lizard builder notes that such details are hard to decide precisely until it becomes clear which path the bridge will take, while the construction helmet nearby spins rhythmically. The project quickly attracts attention. A large werewolf approaches the group and offers to add his strength to the construction, and along the riverbed other interested spectators begin to gather. With a triumphant cry, the young she-wolf declares the work finished, although that bridge is actually just a series of wooden platforms leading to a large boulder, from which a risky jump must be made to reach the other side of the swift river. She gazes into the turbulent rapids with pride and uncertainty in her eyes at the same time. He stands nearby, ready to extend a hand, and at that very moment, a new voice offers help to overcome the final chasm. A cloud of small, many-eyed fluffballs approached the place and asked to join forces with the large team that the werewolf had previously joined. They raise their eyes in surprise when Hakaba addresses their leader and asks if the little creatures understand how to group and divide materials, while Suzuki watches, stunned by this sudden interaction. She stands nearby, not moving away, while he continues to inquire if there are any other categories. The guide points to the materials wood, stone, fur, and confirms that they also distinguish vines and thick ropes. He suddenly realizes that this distinction is crucial. The creatures place leaves and pebbles between the materials, physical markers that indicate the size the bridge should be. The deeper the conversation goes, the more the group gets confused about how to sort the materials and suddenly notices that Sim turns out to be a decisive figure in their grouping and distribution. He observes the leader searching for more universal symbols to replace their piles marked by smells, and this makes him ponder the very essence of sorting. No matter how hard they tried, the bridge held for only 10 crossings before the current tore it away, more of a temporary success than a real one. A shaggy beast approaches and calls the teacher and Suzuki to report that the crossing is possible, pointing to Kashu and Kiku, while the others prepare to wait out the winter frosts. He leads forward to a place where the river narrows, carefully searching for a narrow section through which they can finally cross. He crafted a rough but functional rope crossing over a deep chasm. Hakaba stands at the edge, gazing at the simple structure on the opposite side. The wind whistles through the trees and the shaggy beast waits on the other side. Walking ahead, the young she-wolf clings to the cable and begins a risky descent, and Hakaba holds his breath, realizing that this improvised crossing is just as frightening as the shaky bridge they tried before. She jumps over the gap with a frightened scream. The block fiercely bangs against the rope. Hakaba shouts her name in panic, his heart pounding, watching her small figure blur in the distance. Following her, the huge shaggy beast begins to cross. The rope groans under his colossal weight, and Hakaba can only watch in frozen silence, sweat running down his forehead, as the creature seems to defy gravity over the rocky chasm. As soon as the beast safely reached the other shore, Hakaba asked where Kisho from the lizards had gone, and on the far shore the recovering Suzuki explained that their companion decided not to follow them, so Hakaba just stood, admiring the impressive bison crossing. Finally, the entire squad gathered on the other side, but the tension of the crossing takes its toll. Suzuki collapses, fainted from the adrenaline itself, and the others catch their breath under the darkening sky. Amid the silence of their success, a memory of the professor suddenly surfaced in Hakaba's mind. a lecture about classification being essentially a value system, a way to group the world, which he now sees reflected in the various creatures around him. He feels the burden of leadership, realizes the inherent conflict, and that he is trying to make different species accept one system of thinking. When the lizard people and small fluffy monsters come closer, he admits to himself that maybe he is not the leader he thought he should be. He watches as a young wolf girl sniffs the air, her sharp sense of smell searching for any hint of what lies ahead in the fresh mountain air. He looks at the wide, cluttered valley below and asks himself, is this sprawling place really the goal they were seeking? Later, he finds himself surrounded by the deep, rhythmic snoring of his comrades as the group finally settles down for a well-deserved rest. It is the evening of November 11, and he decides that they must reach Utatsu the next day, watching the pile of sleeping figures as the night grows colder. Attention shifts to the tireless observations of the senior scientist on his obsessed companions, particularly how they smoothly transition from standing to all fours. He extends a bowl of food to one of the creatures, carefully noting how their posture and behavior change due to urgent needs and environmental demands. He managed to decipher basic vocal signals of agreement and denial during patient meetings, opening a small but important window of communication with the pack. He copies their gestures and manners daily to maintain peace and avoid hostility, watching as they diligently stockpile food for the approaching winter and in return occasionally feed him. He considers the little ones incredibly friendly, their mischievous barking and curious sniffing constantly accompany him as they swarm around. Besides the children, a special bond arose between him and the she-wolf who first fed him. Her name remains a mystery to him, but she became his constant companion, helping with research and accompanying him during daily rounds. They walk, she suddenly freezes and points to a plant she gathered. He instantly recognizes it and feels a familiar comfort amid this wild land. She extends a branch of greenery to him. He freezes momentarily in embarrassment. He thinks it is a gift and, to understand, begins to imitate her, reaching out his hand for the present, but his idea of simple imitation proves mistaken. Finally, he takes the plant and begins to chew. The bitter taste fills his mouth, and she silently watches. This act is much more than just food, and he will understand its true meaning only much later in the journey. The long journey finally took its toll. His legs ached and were exhausted after continuous crossings over harsh, uneven terrain. Seeing his discomfort, dry grass intervened and insisted on helping despite his initial hesitation, and when she took hold of his pain, he strangely waved his hands. Later that evening, the group gathered around a crackling campfire, and its warmth became a pleasant relief from the falling snow as they rested their tired bodies in the night silence. By November 13, they managed to reach Utatsu, an endless, snow-covered plain stretched before them just as winter truly began to set in. Standing before a huge, sturdy structure, he felt his role changing. He would no longer be just a guest this winter. He would live in the village and conduct his research as a true resident. As if without a word, the group began to disperse. Each casually moved away, seeking their warm spot by the water, and he remained surprised by the suddenness of it all. He watched them leave, felt a slight sadness at the sudden parting, but remembered that in the wolf language there is no word for goodbye. They considered such separations simply the scattering of the pack. Seeing his pensive mood, Suzuki smiled and gladly suggested going together to choose houses. After all, they will still stay in the same village. She dreams of a warm home in a lively district while they survey the landscape of Utatsu. The settlement is strewn with stone foundations and building frames, remnants of former dwellings that could become the start of their winter shelter. As walking further, steam rises from the ground, a clear sign of the geothermal nature of this region, and the warmth from these natural vents sharply contrasts with the biting cold of the surrounding snow. Their exploration was suddenly interrupted by a huge, friendly werewolf who offered them shelter and even noted that there was a place for the girl. But the scientist, though grateful, decided to inspect the surroundings further before making a final decision. Eventually, they come across a solitary, half-ruined structure pressed against snowy shores. A lone wolf watches from the shadow of stone walls as they approach the possible refuge. Upon closer inspection, the man sees half of the building has succumbed to time, but the other half is still livable. He suggests fencing off the collapsed part and turning the rest into a comfortable dwelling, and his companion readily agrees. Suddenly, a voice sounded from the neighboring house. In Utatsu, any abandoned property is quickly taken by others, so feeling the urgency, he decided they must immediately start repairs, but the dreadful thought that they would have to fix everything themselves began to weigh on him. Despite warnings about thefts, the girl leaves a pile of supplies right by the entrance. He looks at the food, unable to believe his eyes, and asks himself if it is worth risking valuable resources like that after being told how harsh this settlement can be. He asks where to get the necessary building materials, and she honestly says she has no idea. It turns out that as newcomers to this geothermal corner, they are both equally unprepared for the difficulties of setting up their new life. She points to a distant group as if hinting that they might have the needed materials. Her companion looks at the map, confused by the many crossouts that make the document almost illegible. He agrees with her words and notices that from that path ahead, locals are coming in a steady stream, carrying supplies. Approaching the settlement, they notice scattered marks and signs here and there like clues hiding some order in this seemingly chaotic town. Nearby flows a steaming geothermal stream. Its warm waters carry fragments of wood, worn by rains and winds. They come across a local who enthusiastically explains why flushing logs are needed, pointing out which piles have already been processed and which are still raw. The local excitedly describes the meticulous process. The wood is boiled in hot streams so that the bark softens and can be easily removed, and then it is thoroughly cleaned of all residues. He continues to explain, saying that as soon as the firewood dries, everyone can take what they need, and she eagerly offers to join the work. While they work, she shudders the locals' snack on boiled insects taken from the wood, but her companion quickly finds something more familiar to share. She happily crunches the local treats as if she doesn't care where they come from, and Hakaba gets distracted seeing others taking processed wood without joining the work. Seeing this, he approaches the nearest villager and asks if this is even allowed here. The shapeshifter explains that these materials are often exchanged as payment for other work, and no one in this village reproaches them for it. He noticed that his companion pays no attention to social games. She is completely absorbed in her food. Then his gaze slid to another part of the geothermal streams, and he realized that some pools are meant for bathing, not industrial work. Seeing an opportunity, he points out the steaming pools to her and says how much he has missed the luxury of a real hot bath. He understands that this is not only for his comfort, he wants her to be well washed too, so he suggests taking advantage of the opportunity and simultaneously washing the worn clothes from the road. He asks to wait just a moment while he prepares everything. With a determined nod, he gets ready to step into the fray. As soon as he immersed himself, the warmth revives him, although the cloth for rubbing which one of the small spotted creatures extends feels strangely rough on his skin. He calls her, urging her to join him in the water before the biting cold air sets in. She stands at the edge, hesitating slightly, preparing to enter the steaming pool. She stubbornly stands still and does not move an inch. Hakaba looks at her from the warm water in the pool and wonders whether it is because of a deep hatred of bathing or simply because of the burning heat of the geothermal water. Although she hesitated, he still acted. He splashed a handful of water at her side, and the sudden splash caught her off guard. She panicked and flustered, trying not to get wet. The struggle that began is harder than any mountain crossing. It fights fiercely, thrashing wildly in the water, and he desperately tries to calm it, shouting for it not to move, and the splashes become unbearably wild. After the exhausting bath, she keeps a cold distance and refuses to talk to him when they leave the pools. They trudge through the snow, loaded with as many melted logs as they can carry, and he notices a strange roof that was not there before. His confusion deepens as he notices a huge, shaggy creature curled up on the ground. He freezes in shock and cannot comprehend who or what this sleeping beast is. When night falls on November 13, the tension between them does not subside. He settles into his sleeping bag, hoping that by morning she will be in a better mood, and she simply curls up and falls asleep without a word, leaving the secret of their new companion for tomorrow. On the morning of November 4, the young traveler woke up and found that the moisture on his hair had turned to ice. He checked his companion and asked if she had been cold during the night, but she simply replied that the place where he had slept provided plenty of warmth. As soon as they moved, a huge hairy beast nearby began devouring the offerings that Sasuke had set out the day before. He watched the creature eat, and gradually it dawned on him. Perhaps this simple act of hospitality was the reason their shelter was repaired while they were away. He was curious if she had planned it that way. He asked the girl, and she explained that her mother had taught her. This is simply how it is done in their people, a custom passed down from generation to generation to preserve mutual respect for the creatures of the wild. After the meal, the giant beast stood up and left, as if the shelter was only a temporary refuge, leaving behind a brief "thank you" that caught the traveler by surprise. She noticed the changing season and remarked that since it was a migratory winter, their need for food would only increase. This word momentarily confused him, as he imagined the consequences of the migration season. With a clear purpose for the day, she resolutely set out to find food, while he stayed behind, deciding that his task now was to strengthen their shelter against the fierce elements. He began constructing a wooden frame, recalling the professor's instructions on how to stuff gaps with moss and earth to create protection from the biting winter wind. He stands before his work, his face growing increasingly irritated because the wooden structure wobbles precariously despite following the professor's meticulous notes exactly. His attempt proved unstable, and he does not understand where he went wrong. A sudden sharp sound startled him and broke his concentration. Realizing that his current approach was failing, he decided that gathering moss and stuffing the gaps with it was the next logical step. While he contemplates his next move, Suzuki sharply brings him back to the harsh reality of this place. Everything left unattended is someone's prey. This discovery pierces him with anxiety because their hard-earned building materials are now defenseless. He understands that it is impossible. He cannot carry heavy materials nor secure them in any way, and as despair begins to creep in, his gaze falls on the massive, shaggy figure of a bison monster resting nearby. His mind swarms with questions as he weighs his options. He knows the house must be fortified before the arrival of the icy night air, but leaving the place unguarded seems to him a reckless risk. Taking a risk, he approaches the great beast and offers it a place to rest, explaining that he wants to repair and improve its shelter, and the creature looks at him calmly, as if knowing everything with its gaze. He exhaled with immense relief. The massive beast settled into the snow with a heavy muffled rumble, as if agreeing to the invitation, and now that the guardian occupied the space, the threat of their materials being plundered vanished. He could finally focus on his task. Luck does not abandon him. He finds a patch of suitable moss much closer than expected, but the moment of triumph is interrupted by a sudden movement nearby. He looks up and gasps in astonishment. Suddenly he was struck by déjà vu as a transparent creature explained that it had come to help with the repairs and that there was enough space here for many more hands. Next to them, a hairy beast tries to communicate in a broken language, which is even harder to understand than the language of the lizard people, and asks if a specific dwelling has been chosen for their work. He clearly says he wants to find a home, but when he asks about the centaur-like creature from the previous night, his question is met with a gloomy, thoughtful silence from the companions. The slimy creature urges him to continue gathering moss, while nearby a huge beast grazes, its powerful jaws rhythmically chewing vegetation. He looks at the creature in confusion and wonders if in this land his idea of using moss as insulation is considered strange. Their path led to a strangely sturdy dwelling, a solid structure made of stone and earth, which stood out brightly against the snowy landscape. Looking at the extensive repairs, he wonders how many materials were needed and begins to guess which of the inhabitants would dare to undertake such a huge task. Suddenly it dawned on him, those who grab materials without putting in any work are simply selfish, and this trait exists in any world. He stood before the stone entrance, listening as the hairy beast said there was enough space inside for everyone. It began to dawn on him that these creatures were not just prowling, they were actively cooperating to build a life here. This discovery struck him deeply. What he had considered mere survival turned out to be a complex division of labor, and he stood with wide-open eyes as parts of their social structure finally fell into place, revealing a community where everyone had their role. Following the massive creature through the snow-dusted valley, he watched in admiration as they crossed this harsh land with such determination. Their path was quiet, disturbed only by the creak of boots and the thud of heavy paws on the frozen ground as they gathered materials. When they reached the structure, he threw himself into work, carefully stuffing thick bundles of moss into the cracks between stones to block drafts. Despite the piercing cold and fatigue, he managed to insulate the place well. He was determined to make it livable. As the sun began to set behind the horizon, a familiar figure emerged from among the trees, panting from exhaustion after a long day. She had spent those hours gathering a pile of insects and dried meat and returned just as the light began to fade. She immediately noticed the repaired wall and chirped with joy at how helpful her teacher was in the renovation, and he modestly waved it off, explaining that it was almost entirely the merit of the strength and efforts of the werewolf. Ignoring his shyness, the girl jumped up to the hairy beast and curiously sniffed its thick, tousled fur. She said in surprise that the beast actually smelled pleasant, and he stood and looked at this with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement. The huge creature stood motionless while she examined the place, a silent witness to how, in the fading light, the bond between these different travelers was strengthening. The group settled in, and their temporary shelter finally began to feel like a reliable refuge from the outside world. The shaggy creature changed the mood of the company. All began sharing provisions. When Suzuki tasted the local mushrooms, Hakaba decided it would be fair to give some of his dried meat and insects in return, and the girl, amused by this exchange, jokingly started calling the teacher Mr. Mushroom, and the nickname stuck among them. As night fell, he raised his eyes to the darkening sky and felt that the air was surprisingly soft. The coziness of the evening was quickly disturbed by the late return of a massive creature resembling a centaur. Its appearance was unexpected, and heavy breathing echoed through the quiet camp as it settled in for the night. Suddenly, the beast began to eat something it was not supposed to touch, causing instant panic. The teacher and the girl shouted, begging it to stop, their voices rising in a desperate attempt to prevent it from eating that possibly poisonous plant. But to their surprise, the creature did not react at all and continued to chew calmly as if nothing had happened. Because of this strange indifference, she noticed strange stones embedded in the creature's thick fur and pointed to them anxiously. Recalled the story of the lizard folk they had met earlier. These stones were not decorations, but a status symbol worn only by the most respected elders of their kind. He leaned closer and looked at the old beast in a completely different way. The lack of reaction was not resistance or stubbornness, but probably a sign of old age. It seemed the creature was very old and perhaps had worse hearing, so their panicked cries went unheard. Reflecting on this discovery, he realized that his research must take into account such individual differences. Even within one species, the needs and condition of an older individual can be completely different from the rest of the pack, and this realization became the beginning of a new chapter in his work. Promised himself to understand the unique circumstances of each creature he meets on this journey. In old chronicles, two different images of the inhabitants of the underworld have formed. One, born in the flames of conflict, sees them as a wild, hostile force under the rule of a single king, but intelligent enough to create a complex society. But another point of view reduces these creatures to simple plants and animals, to natural resources and livestock to be exploited. When the young traveler enters the office, the weight of these conflicting expectations hangs heavily in the air, sharply contrasting with the quiet bookroom where his mentor sits reading. Confirming that the departure is scheduled in 2 days, he forces the professor to notice the shadow of anxiety in his eyes. The old man reminds him of the main lesson. None of these extreme views show who the inhabitants of the otherworld really are. This wisdom is a warning against the distorting lens of fear, which pushes one to believe the worst or see only what one wants. And like a distant balloon in the sky, the advice to remain objective and not cling to ready-made notions strikes straight to the heart. Returning to the reality of his journey, the traveler warmly greets a diverse group of creatures gathered in the snow. A fluffy beast, scaly lizard folk, and a werewolf with gray fur, standing shoulder to shoulder as a living testament to the complexity his mentor spoke of. He explains that he is looking for food, hoping to learn where they procure sustenance in this harsh land. The creatures look puzzled by his request. Their concept of food and places to find it is completely different from his. The werewolf pointed to a distant hut and firmly stated that it could be eaten, and the traveler and his young companion Suzuki froze in disbelief. The idea of an edible house did not fit their common sense. Soon they approach a huge building where monsters casually gnaw on the very walls. A stunning realization overwhelms the traveler. The locals have started calling his own home the edible house, because that is literally how they interpret the resources it provides. He looks pragmatically, observing how both the neighbors and passersby feast on the moss growing along the walls. A strange sight, but he understands that there is some benefit in it. He is almost always nearby, so he sees. Guests sometimes use their belongings but often leave them, and the sheer number of people near the house deters them. There is much less chance that their things will disappear when they go out. In a moment he thinks that some travelers stay only overnight. The faces change so quickly that it is impossible to remember them all, but despite this chaos he understands. Openly welcoming them into the house is better, it is safer for them, and they have more resources. With each day some faces become familiar. Lemasi, who arrived recently, an old centaur who returns every night, and even a fluffy lizard who does not speak the local dialect. He admits that although some are regulars, like the one he calls Mr. Mushroom, it is still difficult for him to distinguish several of them. Because the work is slow, he is about to leave and apologizes to Suzuki for his departure. He admits that he is a bit confused. While he was fussing gathering moss and she was taking care of food, his real research over the past week has barely progressed. Nearby, a shaggy beast sharply interrupts his thoughts and says that the wall material is insufficient. It is not bark, because actually soil and earth are needed to strengthen the structure. Because he recognizes the beast from a sturdy house nearby, he listens attentively as the creature offers to take him to a source of quality soil, and the beast calls him to go together, seeing a chance to help improve the human homemade. Deciding to take the chance, he told Suzuki that he was going for materials. She shuddered, watching him leave her alone with lamias and follow the massive creature into the wild wilderness. He struggles heavily through the snow beside the massive, fluffy beast. His breath catches. He understands that the rhythmic thudding of their steps could attract unwanted attention. The bison monster seems completely unconcerned, its steady pace echoing across the frozen landscape. As they walk, he thoughtfully reflects on the strange selflessness of these creatures, noting that their hospitality is more than simple kindness. When he asks if they can truly coexist on his land, the beast simply gestures toward the horizon, as if to say there is plenty of room for others. His gaze slides to the neighboring dwelling, where the lamia crawls into a dark hole, hiding from the cold. This closeness allowed him to see beyond their monstrous appearances and begin to understand the nuances of their life. He watches as a group of smaller creatures move from one structure to another as if without any conflict. They have a different attitude toward property sharing and taking turns using the dwelling, and this communal order seems to serve them well. Continuing the journey through the snowy wastelands, the hairy guide began speaking in fragments of dialect, saying that land was needed to fill certain gaps. His speech was rough, a mix of guttural sounds and simple ideas that had to be carefully deciphered. He surprisingly easily manages to decode the bees' language, a skill he probably honed during long days with his lizard-like brothers and sisters. The bison stops and points to a patch of land where the snow has thinned, revealing dark soil. The creature speaks about combining the land with something else, a word that in his mind sounds like an impossible mixture. He froze, recalling that this term usually describes things that simply cannot coexist, as if a fundamental contradiction. He dropped to one knee to examine the frozen ground and skeptically spoke about such a paradoxical combination. But the beast is unyielding, insisting that what he considers impossible is quite real in this strange land. He watches intently as the shaggy beast demonstrates the properties of the local soil. The beast explains that by combining the soil with moss and other vegetation, a special carrier material is formed surprisingly strong. When the beast began to move away, he froze for a moment, confused by the sudden departure. The animal slowly made its way through the snow, and he followed with a bucket in hand, curious where they were heading next. Soon they approach the edge of a dark, viscous swamp that seems to pulse with life, and the monster warns him not to get too close to that slippery mass, showing how treacherous and unpredictable it is. He listens as the creature explains what the material is, for it excellently seals gaps and retains heat in the house, but is deadly flammable, and points to a sinister picture. A limb covered in mud sticks out of the swamp, as if an orc or perhaps a werewolf tragically died, stuck in the suffocating depths. While he weighs the dangers of the swamp, his attention is suddenly distracted by the appearance of a wolf girl. She approaches with a firm gaze, holding a small vessel in her hands and paying no heed to the gloom around. She stops at the edge of a dark hole in the frozen ground. Her fragile figure sharply stands out against the dazzling white snow, and she prepares to act. With a mischievous sparkle in her eyes, she announces that she will combine the essence of the water slime with the mysterious substance they found to create an impossible mixture, and begins pouring a clear liquid from a bottle, impatiently awaiting the results of her experiment. The liquid cascades into the dark void and merges with the viscous mud in a silent, transformative reaction that defies the laws of nature. She never actually said that these substances were incompatible. Instead, the young scientist realized that his memory had failed him regarding the exact words. Realizing this, he watched as the she-wolf passionately demonstrated the new idea, her many hands wildly waving as she declared that it had to be this way. While she led the lesson, he carefully and diligently recorded his observations, saying that recently he had focused on the complex language of the harpies, which she was teaching him. He asked if the limb movements had separate meanings, and she honestly admitted that she herself was unsure. She was silent, and he immersed himself in thoughts about linguistic nuances and noticed that the snakes, which had recently left, were absent. He wondered if he should delve into their language, supposedly related to the harpy language he was currently mastering. As he watched them leave, the small shelter became even emptier for the night. Only the scientist, the wolf girl, and the shaggy beast remained, and he could not help but notice that people usually stayed at this dwelling less than at others in the area. Although they could not speak, he continued to care for that huge creature, feeding it while it rested nearby. Why it stayed was a mystery, but he felt responsible for it and could not imagine leaving it out in the cold. By the end of November, he finally saw the fruits of their labor. The new insulation made the dwelling much cozier. When the long night fell, the beast gently rubbed its muzzle in gratitude, and the scientists silently reflected on the warmth they had created together. Ikaba thoughtfully reflects on the nuances of the local language, especially on the words for mixing and disputes, and looks at the dish before him, noticing how different ingredients merge into one inseparable whole like those complex human connections he tries to organize. He records these observations in a diary and admits, although definitions provide clarity, they steal the broad, fluid shades of the original expressions, and translation feels like a double-edged sword. It sharpens understanding but loses the essence of what was said. When he stepped to the entrance, he was greeted by a howling wind and swirling snow. The blizzard was only gaining strength. As he reaches for the door, a young she-wolf instantly intervenes. "Don't close it all the way, you might smother the fire we are warming ourselves by," and she explains how delicate the balance must be to keep our shelter habitable in such fierce weather. Then he notices a large hairy beast who usually is the first to go outside, now curled up in the shelter, hiding from the piercing cold. At the end of November, the entire Utatsu region is covered by a white veil of winter. The first big storm of the season arrives. Returning to his place, he takes a bowl of food from a companion and sincerely thanks for the simple meal. She brings more supplies and explains that with the cold, they started processing moss from the walls into food. He learns that although the moss was initially insulation, its nutritional properties turned out to be a real lifesaver during the hungry winter months. She gently strokes the tousled fur of the bison-like monster and notices its lethargy. It seems to be eating less moss, probably because their supplies are dwindling. Nearby, a young she-wolf groans. He overeated on wall moss and clearly has a stomach ache. He reaches into his backpack and pulls out a dense rectangular block of emergency ration, hands it to his companion and asks if she can eat it, but she only skeptically sniffs the dry ration. While he grinds the ration to make it more edible, thoughts about the harsh truth of this land trouble him. These snowstorms can cut them off for days. He is worried about the cold and limited food supplies, and he hesitates whether to resort to emergency reserves already, as the temperature in the hut keeps falling. Outside, the world vanished into a white wasteland, and the wind howled with predatory fury, pushing snow drifts against the shelter and covering the landscape with an icy veil. He approaches the entrance, intending to close the door against the piercing wind, but the girl suddenly interrupts him, trembling violently from the cold, and desperately shouts a warning, insisting that he cannot close the way yet. He is confused by her resistance. He tries to drive her inside to warmth, but she breaks free. Her teeth chatter as she desperately repeats her plea, and he does not understand why she stubbornly keeps the door open, even though the cold outside is severe. He freezes, struck by the specificity of her protest. She does not say that she does not want the door closed. She asserts that it is impossible, as if waiting for something or someone. The reason for her stubbornness suddenly becomes clear. Through the opening spills a flock of small, fluffy creatures seeking shelter from the storm. When the last latecomers are safely inside, she finally asks him to close the entrance, her duty to the little helpers fulfilled. He watches Suzuki shiver and realizes, in the very heart of this relentless blizzard, their humble home was probably chosen by these newcomers only because the door was left open. With so many new people in the small room, it has become significantly warmer, and the cramped space makes every movement a real challenge. When the animals vigorously shake the snow from their fur, he understands that everyone must be especially careful and attentive to avoid any friction in such a tight space. Suddenly, one of the reptiles lets out a sharp, hoarse cry, and he immediately asks if they are all traveling together. While the small, long-eared creature curiously sniffs him, he notices that the sounds of these lizard-like beings are completely unlike those he has heard from other lizard people, as if they are from a different kind. He continues to observe their interactions, noticing various dartings and calls, and comes to the conclusion that they probably do not share a common language with the werewolves and may have just met. After he shares some warm porridge with crackers, the creatures respond by placing various small items near the fire, such as smooth stones. He finds it strange. Instead of food, they offer stones, and this makes him wonder if they come from a completely different culture than the one he knows. He watched as small creatures slowly sank into a deep sleep, probably exhausted from the journey, and his gaze fell on the small items laid out before him: a shell, a pebble, a piece of bone. He wondered if this was their quiet way of getting to know each other in a world without common words. A sudden rhythmic clatter broke the silence of the shelter, and the sound of pebbles rubbing against each other sharply and deliberately caught his attention against the quiet breathing of the sleepers. He suddenly sat up sharply, eyes wide open. Only then did he realize that he had probably dozed off for a moment. Nearby, a young she-wolf was intently examining the small pile of trinkets. When he asked what she was doing, she simply replied that she was playing, and he was left to wonder what game could be invented with such simple things. She honestly admitted that she did not understand the rules at all, looking puzzled as the others continued their business. He noticed how they carefully arranged various objects on the ground and realized that this was not just a random game, but some kind of organized board game. When he realized that he was being called to participate, he was struck by sudden surprise. He leaned forward and the others moved aside to make room for him. Their silent invitation was understood even without a single word. It was a landmark moment, his first real competition with the inhabitants of the otherworld. He recalled that in his world, games often became a bridge when words failed, a universal behavior that arose when even different species found themselves together. He watched closely as the furry beast made a move, pushing some objects forward and pulling others back. It seemed that the whole game was in these simple spatial choices, and he began to catch repetitions, trying to decipher the logic of each arrangement. He began to draw conclusions. Sliding an object closer could mean either possession or a scored point. Staring intently at the pile of nuts and pebbles, he prepared to make his first move, determined to understand the rules of this silent exchange. He stood next to his young companion, listening as she confidently asserted that one should pick up objects closest to their opponent. Their theories had already begun to diverge, and he suddenly realized that he would have to deduce the rules of the game during the match to win. He needed to find out the exact conditions under which his pieces were removed from the board. Looking at the improvised board, he noticed that the things concentrated near the large shaggy beast were almost all white or pale shades shells and smooth pebbles. When he noticed this, he decided to test the idea of picking by color and finally understood the logic of the previous hint from his companion. The objects near the beast really strangely matched in appearance, and he had not noticed this before. He thought about how to classify things by their essence, maybe something like food, maybe even his heart attack, or elements like dirt and insects, and the question of which move his companion would choose was already spinning in his head. Suddenly she stretched out her hand and placed a chip, and he gasped in complete surprise, unable to comprehend her move. The horned beast silently watched the scene with a stony, restrained tension, its large eyes fixed on the board. To his surprise, she simply said that she chooses things by a similar feeling, and this confession made him doubt whether he had been searching in vain for some logical connection. When he asked if his approach was wrong, she only disdainfully shook her head slightly, leaving him to reconsider his strategy. In a moment, the shaggy beast made its move, carefully laying down a few more pale round objects on the playing field amid quiet clicks and rustles. As he watched the new pieces take their places, he was suddenly struck, and he finally understood the hidden pattern guiding the game. He realizes this game is not about competition, but about seeing how each perceives the world in their own way. When the young she-wolf asks how one even wins here, it becomes clear to him that the concept of victory here might be entirely different. He sees how this discovery leaves her with wide-open eyes and confused, because the very idea of winning seems foreign in the monster's game. When around 5 in the evening the sun begins to set, the gathering gradually disperses, leaving behind shells and stones that served as game chips. She notices that since the result was already decided by simple selection, the objects that could be considered prizes are simply left abandoned. He watches with fascination as everyone treats the things with complete indifference and does whatever they please now that the ritual of the game is over. After a hard mental day, he went to bed as early as 7 and fell into such a deep sleep that he slept through the entire next day, while outside the blizzard raged relentlessly, and they waited in the comfort of their shelter for the coming morning. On December 3rd, it finally became easier. The sky cleared for the first time in what seemed like eternity. The young traveler stretched and took a deep breath of the icy air, and his little companion energetically shook the last remnants of cold from her fur. He leads them to a temporary shelter. They move to the house of that hairy beast they had met earlier. When they arrive, the girl settles down and begins to gnaw on a piece of wood, completely focused on it. Looking around, he sees how much damage the blizzard has caused to the city, ruins and broken buildings everywhere, and this probably explains the numerous changes and corrections on the professor's old map. The traveler understands that the movement of the inhabitants and the destruction of their homes probably happened exactly when the professor was drawing the map, and he notices that the earliest sections were sketched with simple, illegible inscriptions marking the former dwellings of various people. He froze, staring at the structure before them, thoughts suggesting that it might once have been called the home of the old centaur. Now it is an empty shell where different creatures have gathered to seek shelter and work together. Peering inside, he realizes the building has been converted into a shared workshop, so now it is impossible to live here like in a private home. The space hums with work, filled with the clatter of tools, voices, and the presence of many different creatures. While they remain, he and his companion rely on glances and facial expressions, exchanging signals with those who are weathering the storm without a common language. Their eyes say everything. Understanding and connection born during a crisis. As he tries to close the distance, imitating their calls, he finds himself under the watchful, unblinking gaze of a small reptile. The silent observation unsettles him a little while a girl watches this exchange from afar. He looks at the chaotic workshop. Volatile powder scattered on the floor sometimes merges with heat-sensitive substances. Nearby, a small, fluffy creature raises an alarm, and a huge lizard continues to work hard, unaware of possible dangers. The young traveler suddenly realizes the black marks left by the lizard creatures are a warning, screaming about immediate danger to those who can read them. Impressed by the discovery, he flips through his notes, closely watching the reptile-like workers nearby and pondering how deep their silent language is. His gaze fell on a nearby hairy, goat-like beast, and at that moment Suzuki recoiled, her nose wrinkled at a sharp smell she recognized as another sign of danger. Looking down at his feet, he wondered, what if these hoofprints of the creature are not just random tramples but deliberate signs or letters like the writing of lizard people? The shaggy beast moves closer, its large, intelligent eyes fixed on the notebook in the man's hands, and the beast begins to mimic the man's movements, reaching its paw toward the paper. This is not just observation, the thought strikes him suddenly. The creature understands the purpose of his drawings and can use them too. He froze silently in amazement as the beast took the tool and began to draw a clear, recognizable image of itself on the flat surface, demonstrating a level of intelligence he had never expected. He burst out with joy, his voice echoing through the shelter as he celebrated a great breakthrough. For him, it was the first time a creature from the beyond not only understood what art was but also recognized its reflection in these lines. The moment of triumph was suddenly cut short when a shaggy beast lunged forward and unexpectedly struck him with its head, shaking him. Clutching his chest in pain, he gasped, bewildered by the sudden aggression, and wondered if he had accidentally offended this creature. When the tension subsided and the beast calmed down, he briefly pulled himself together, grateful that it was finally quiet enough around to see clearly, and with a weary sigh accepted the unpredictability of his companions. Outside the window, the blizzard howled intermittently. On November 28, he opened his diary to record their forced stagnation. Reviewing the latest entries, he noticed with interest how their situation had changed. But the harsh reality of the storm demanded they conserve strength and food, remaining as still as possible. In the oppressive silence of darkness, the shaggy beast offered strange comfort. Its rough tongue licked him, and they cuddled closely, while the intellectual spark from his earlier fascination with drawings faded, replaced by a simple, primal urge for closeness. The next morning, November 29, he was jolted awake by piercing cold and the heavy, rhythmic sound of something being dragged across the floor. Still sleepy, he watched as others took on the exhausting task dragging the huge, furry beast to the exit. Confused by this sudden turn, he asked the lizard-like guide why they were throwing the creature out into the icy wind, but quickly realized the futility of his question without a common language. He was forced to watch silently, unable to demand explanations for their seemingly cruel actions. Standing on the threshold, he watched the beast disappear into the white void of the storm, and a bitter realization dawned on him. In this ruthless world, if you do not meet certain unwritten conditions, you are cast out into the cold. He bent over his diary, ink rustling on the paper as he recorded the icy indifference of the shelter's inhabitants. No one even showed a shadow of concern for the fate of the old centaur, and this discovery began to overturn his very perception of this otherworldly realm. He observed how by noon their harsh practicality became even more grim. They moved the lifeless body to seal a cold gap in the wall, and the thought that he too could be discarded just as easily haunted him. He realized that once the centaur was no longer used as a heat source, he would become mere raw material to them. With a heavy heart, he noticed that the next night, when the blizzard finally subsided, a crowd gathered not to mourn but to quickly get rid of what remained, and his own notes grew increasingly biased, permeated by the grim reality of people rushing in a mob to snatch their share from the fallen beast. He watched them go as the storm died down. Temporary residents seeking shelter slipped into the white void without uttering a word of farewell. This made him doubt whether these creatures were capable of emotions at all, or if every one of their actions was governed solely by cold, rational survival. He truly began to see the world differently only when a young she-wolf spoke to him on December 2. She casually remarked that his scent had changed while he slept, and this simple observation forced him to acknowledge his bias born of fear. She recounted what he missed in his exhaustion, telling how the old centaur quietly died in his sleep. As soon as the others sensed the change in his scent, they carried the body from the warm place and began the funeral, a customary and heartless one. Looking back, he realized how deeply he had become attached to that old creature during the height of the blizzard. This bond was probably more a product of his own despair than genuine reciprocity with the beast. When the small, fluffy creature brought the tray with food, he decided, first of all, to recover. Reflecting, he saw how the weakened body and the fear overwhelming him had so changed his view of the surrounding world. He looks at the meat and understands, to truly honor the fallen beast, it must be eaten. Nearby, a young she-wolf is already tearing her share, driven by primal hunger. Seeing how she drools with impatience, he understands. Yesterday she fasted only because he fasted. The burden of leadership falls on him. He must eat so that she eats too. They eat together in the silence of the snowy landscape. She admits that she did not expect the food to be so delicious, and he quietly agrees that her warmth is a pleasant relief. They sit side by side against the backdrop of an endless white, expansive small patch of life in an icy desert. Suddenly, a long, scaly finger stretched out and gently pushed him in the cheek, abruptly pulling him out of his thoughts. He suddenly turns and sees Kiku, the younger brother of the lizard-like ones, looming over them. The creature pushes Sasuke too, making her cry out in fear, while he mutters about the tempting sand of their meat. The reptile traveler sincerely sighed with relief upon seeing both of them alive. This was truly Kiku. His pale scales stood out against the white snow. He says he is going to a place where common sense prevails and rejoices to see that they survived recent hardships. It seems to him as if an eternity has passed since their last meeting. The lizard-like creature leans forward, its sharp features softening at the simple question when it asks if they want to go with him. Hakaba is momentarily confused, unsure of what is happening, but quickly decides to follow. He is touched by the unexpected kindness of the being who is looking specifically for them. Suzuki, already overflowing with excitement, shouts a resolute yes, her voice ringing with pure, uncontrollable joy. Hakaba sits on the shaggy beast and watches as Kika makes his way through the snow, and although he has no fur, this lizardman is strangely resilient to the biting cold, and also notices that the earth has a beautiful color, a phrase that stirs the traveler's curiosity. He thoughtfully turned over in his mind that strange manner of speech of the lizardmen. Kika calls the sky and sea their special shades, and this prompted the young man to think that the word for color among the lizardmen is different from that of the werewolves, and therefore their cultures see the world differently. December 3, since noon the group has been following their slow guide. The pace exhausts with its sluggishness, but they steadfastly continue their path through the icy expanse, tracking the measured steps of the lizards as they. Another warning sign appeared on their path and Hakaba pointed to it, saying that it was also a danger sign like those they had seen before, only slightly different in appearance. Suddenly Suzuki recoils, his nose wrinkling from the disgusting smell coming from the marker. He notices that this smell is not at all like the previous one and realizes the werewolves avoid this marker because the smell instinctively repels them. Interested in the gaze of the lizard-like beings, he asks Kika if he also dislikes the color of the sign. The lizard-like guide simply replies that it is good, showing no disgust toward the visual or olfactory warning that so troubled the wolf girl. This discrepancy pushes him to reflect on the true nature of these warnings. Werewolves react instantly in instinctive aversion to a certain smell, while the lizards send subtle, abstract signs that foreigners with a different culture or different senses often simply do not understand. He concludes the werewolf sign is just a conventional mark associated with some physical obstacle, whereas the lizard sign is a much more direct reflection of the threat itself. The color of this sign by itself means nothing. It is merely a signal for those taught to recognize its meaning. He peers at the massive, shaggy figure of the beast and sees that Koshu is hidden in its thick winter fur, and the lizard men, dulled by the cold, barely move while winter takes over. He gently warns the young werewolf to leave their friend alone, and she meanwhile playfully nudges and rubs her nose against the thick fur, even going so far as to lick the shaggy hide. The giant beast suddenly shuddered, its massive head sharply turned, and it let out a half-cry of surprise. This movement caught it off guard, and it was left wondering what could have caused such a reaction. They set off on their way across the snowy expanses. The brief meeting ended, and he felt a little warmth in his heart when he saw them all together again, even though a cold road lay ahead. The beast Mal spoke in a low, rumbling voice, noting that although he looked weakened, he had finally arrived, and marveled at how much better the creature spoke the wolf language, although its torn and mysterious words were still hard to fully understand. A powerful snort from the beast's nostrils shot straight into his face, a gesture that sounded condescending. The creature noticed that during this journey they would become closer, and he understood this all too well, despite the moist delivery. At first their path leads along a winding hot stream, and the warmth of the water briefly provides relief from the biting cold air. Moving forward, the terrain changes, the snow grows higher, and each step becomes harder as if they are fighting an increasingly fierce winter. He handles the hike without trouble, despite the sudden deep snow, while a huge bison monster goes ahead and blazes a trail through the drifts. Soon the group approaches the entrance to a deep icy cave, where giant icicles hang from the ceiling like frozen spears, making the travelers seem tiny as they step inside. In the icy depths, the wolf girl curls up seeking warmth, her teeth chattering, and she shouts that they must move on before the biting cold takes them. While they rest, he notices one of the lizard folk begins to write, and an epiphany clicks within him. Despite their reptilian nature, they seem to truly appreciate the beauty of the world, from rainbows to these icy icicles. The creature draws a series of marks in brown, dark green, and red and says that it denotes frozen spikes above, but the choice of colors confuses the traveler as he confirms recognition. He asks if this symbol means smell rather than appearance, but the lizard folk quickly dismiss this idea, and he wonders how their combined perception, appearance, and smell forms that special writing. He shifts his attention to other lizards and watches as a creature points to a certain sign, as if saying it wants the object that the sign represents, and this confuses him even more in understanding their signs. Suddenly it dawns on him. Although he doubted the literal accuracy of the colors, the lizard folk flawlessly understood the abstract connection between the symbol and the icicles, and this became a significant breakthrough in his study of their time. He thoughtfully contemplates the intricate script of the lizards and realizes that recognizing all their nuances will take time. Cashew points to the adjacent stalagmite and explains that the symbols he just carved denote this very formation, but despite the explanation, the subtle color distinctions used by the lizards remain unrecognizable to his human eyes. Approaching, he notices the thick, resilient skin of the lizard people, a natural shield against the biting cold, and Cashew confirms that beneath it is truly warm, just as a cry from Suzuki echoes from the cave, drawing his attention back to what is happening here and now. Suddenly, a huge furry beast looms over them. Its voice, dull and powerful, says that it was resting in its lair, and the beast's gaze sharply fixes on the large backpack he carries, as if interrogating where it came from. He tensely ponders the beast's strange interest, hesitating whether the animal is curious about him or the equipment he carries. The backpack was a gift from the professor, an important tool entrusted to him for field research in these remote lands. A wave of realization surged as he stared at the worn fabric of the bag. The weight of its history suddenly seemed much heavier. The fluffy giant extends an invitation, suggesting that the trail ahead has ended, so come with him to his dwelling. He and Suzuki stand small before the creature, silent and considering this unexpected turn in their journey. When they say road, they usually imagine a clear, well-maintained path leading to some place. But in reality, the terrain is much more treacherous. The girl urgently warns the teacher, do not step on that unstable patch of snow. He struggles not to slip on the steep slope, and she points to a sturdy tree for safety, warning him about loose stones above. He recalls how the beast insisted the road was already finished, but ahead there seems to be no path. As the triath scientist, the wolf cub, and the huge shaggy beast climb the mountain, she still controls every move, even showing where to place hands, and he begins to understand that for these creatures the road is not a physical trail, but simply a sequence of safe points they move through. His awareness sharpens as he pays close attention to the creature's words. The word road is read not as a static place but as movement, meaning shifts from the destination to the very process of going there, and he compares the modern phrase going home with the older, archaic construction of the beast. He deciphers that in the ancient language of the werewolves, the verb to go inseparably links the one who goes, and the place they head. Toth beast has already begun replacing modern prepositions with old forms that emphasize the direction of the journey, as if painting a world where the traveler and the destination are part of one action. His reflections continue. He notices that the verb, depending on the context, can mean both to do and to become, and looking at the beast, he understands that the approach can eventually become a transformation itself, becoming similar to the creature through the very act of movement. Finally, he begins to doubt the true meaning of the invitation to the village, whether they called just anyone, or were looking specifically for someone who could endure this merciless march, because the road they are taking is actually just a thin animal trail through wild terrain, a false illusion of safety in a cruel world of survival. He clung to the rock, the professor's voice echoing in his head with cold consolation that survival is the only measure of success, and this offers little comfort while his fingers strain into the stone, and below a young werewolf encourages him, promising that the summit is near. His thoughts drift to their guide, a strange creature named Egio, whom they met in Lime Kills. This creature is a mosaic of different species, silently and steadfastly leading them through treacherous heights. Suddenly the boy breaks the silence with a piercing bird-like cry as if speaking the language of harpies and sees the creature is extremely exhausted. The long road has clearly taken its toll, hence the sharp outburst. Taking a long-awaited break, the small group huddled together against the mountain cold, and the shaggy beast became a wall of warmth for them while they regained strength for the next stage of gathering. He still remembers how at first their group was larger, but the lizard-like companions were frightened by the vertical slopes and at the first hint of a real climb left, leaving the rest alone with the peaks. When he asks how much is left, the answer sounds mysterious. They will have to go exactly as far as they have already traveled. The realization that they are only halfway through this exhausting journey weighs heavily on his soul. When his muscles ached, he began to analyze the linguistic shifts of the local dialect. He notices that the modern language of werewolves already separates I from bodily sensations, a departure from that old, holistic language they once spoke. He dissects the sentence structure in his mind and sees how the embedded grammar begins to mimic human language. This evolution makes the language much more accessible, but at the same time changes the way these creatures perceive their existence. He thoughtfully reflects on linguistic similarities. The language of modern werewolves resembles human grammar, but there is a nuance that troubles him. Continuing this thread of thought, the young scientist asks himself, is this shared structure truly universal, or has some external factor gradually shaped their language over time? Pulling himself up the snowy slope, he immerses his thoughts in the works of the professor, especially in those sections that discuss unexpected similarities between species with completely different sensations. The difficult ascent is interrupted somewhere around midday, when their guide and the furry creature suddenly begin fiercely digging and uprooting the roots of nearby trees in search of food. Seeing the animal rummaging for food, the reptilian guide announced that it was time to have a snack, which greatly surprised the tired traveler, who was not expecting a stop on such a precarious slope. They managed to find a barely flat area to settle, and the guide began unpacking the processed lime, a key part of their supplies. When the guide pours the liquid that starts to hiss and steam, the teacher suddenly realizes they are generating heat through chemistry, not risking open fire in the snow. The mixture bubbles violently, causing someone to shout sharply, "Stay away," while the homemade heater does its job and the young wolf girl watches this enchanted. He watched as Suzuki suddenly took the initiative and arranged an impromptu lesson on how to properly prepare larvae for food, insistently demanding that he learn this too, hastily guiding his hands. She demonstrated firmly and explained that these creatures eat so much that their insides need to be cleaned before cooking. He silently, in sweat and anxiety, watched as the contents were forcibly pushed out, and she beamed with pride the preparation was successful. As the sun slowly dipped and cast long shadows over the snow, the group estimated how far they had come. The light was fading, and noticing that Suzuki was already at her limit, they decided to look for a place to rest, especially since their goal had finally become visible. They struggled through the increasingly dark twilight, and the silhouettes of huge bison and the tall lizard guide led them through the sparse winter trees. When they reached the settlement pressed against the slope, they were greeted by the warm glow of countless lights flickering on the dark mountainside, and she looked at this cluster of lanterns with admiration, finding peace in their light just in time, as night had fully taken over everything. Their arrival was met by an old man wrapped in thick furs with long white hair and a beard that made him look like a sage. He extended his hand in greeting, but his appearance caused the young traveler to freeze in pure shock. He could not take his eyes off. His thoughts raced as he stared into the face of the stranger. It seemed human, but a closer look at the man's hands revealed a shocking truth. They were clearly non-human, and this proved that in this land appearance often deceives. Although questions remained about their owner, the fatigue from the journey finally took its toll. She nestled into the fluffy fur of their pack animal, eyes heavy, and said it was time for all of them to sleep. Ikaba stands on the wooden balcony, his gaze stubbornly fixed on the distant mountain ridge, while the morning clouds of December 6th begin to rise, and he tries to tame the whirl of thoughts that had troubled him since the moment he arrived in this remote settlement. His reflections are interrupted by a simple need to eat, and when he took a bite, he was surprised to realize that quite some time had passed since he last tasted bark, the main food in this harsh area. Nearby, the shaggy beast Mal and young Suzuki were already intently eating their portions, impatiently craving the same bark. Even amid quiet sorrow, he is deeply puzzled. The cause of his confusion stands right before him. An old man, though gentle in appearance, hides a secret the traveler has yet to unravel. The elder offers a warm, weathered smile and a simple morning greeting. He reciprocates, but there is a hint of hesitation in his voice as he continues to observe the strange behavior of that man. Without any warning, the old man leaned forward, his nose twitched, he deeply inhaled the scent of the young traveler, and then suddenly gently pressed his face to his. The boy froze, confused and unsure how to respond to such a primal display of closeness. After this unexpected wave of tenderness, he shows the brought items among them, apparently, a formal greeting from the lizard folk. He talks about the village and recalls how the teacher handed over some very important papers. Seeing this scene, Suzuki, with a sparkle in his eyes, suggested running outside to search the village, and he agreed. Thoughts swirled in his head that the elder might have gone to retrieve the rest of the professor's lost papers. They step into the sharp mountain air and he freezes at the sight of steam rising from beneath the ground. The elder confirms, warm streams run here, sharply contrasting with the surrounding snow. He carefully studies the map and notices that they are now comfortably situated between the town of Lamia and Utatsu. He wonders if the usual routes would become passable if the roads were restored, and where in this vast, snowy wilderness the Mao community might be hiding. Continuing the walk through the settlement, he surveys the surroundings and asks if the absence of werewolves is a direct consequence of the road collapse. The group passes several hairy creatures, like bison, resting in warm water. Noticing the old man leading them, he politely introduces himself as Akaba, but although he tries to be professional, curiosity gets the better of him, and he cautiously asks the old man what his true nature is. Before he can get an answer, the old man suddenly lunges forward with astonishing speed, and this move catches the young teacher off guard. His eyes widen in surprise. Suddenly he is overwhelmed when the elder energetically rubs his nose and sniffs him, a primal, instinctive display of affection or greeting that confuses him. He cries out in shock as the large man in fur invades his personal space. In the close encounter, he clearly sees the wrinkled face of the elder and suddenly experiences a strange revelation. This man strangely resembles the owner of his boarding house, and the elder, seemingly unaware of his inner astonishment, asks with grandfatherly concern if he is eating enough. He hastily steps back, his face burning with shame after such an intense interaction. He confesses to Suzuki that instincts took over, a primal fight or flight reaction. The young she-wolf watches him leave and aloud asks if the elder reminded him of her father or perhaps himself, and indeed he did. He doesn't even stop to explain but quickly moves away from the scene. Suzuki remains behind, tilting her head in surprise and watching as her teacher flees from the unexpected hospitality of the elders. He cautiously stands between his young companion and the calm elder, the initial shock from the greeting slowly fading and turning into quiet observation of the surroundings. Thinking about their journey, he recalls, the hairy beast Mao initially did not speak the wolf tongue, and this discovery vividly shows how complex and intertwined the linguistic life of this colorful group is, where understanding each other is rarely simple. Observing the conversations around, he notes that the languages of harpies and lamias dominate, the lizard folk maintain their native tongue, and there are no werewolves here at all, so Suzuki's role becomes even more important. His curiosity boils as he watches the elder and the reptilian Ehio in a cloak carefully preparing food. Looking closely, he recognizes the substance wrapping something like cheese. It resembles wax paper, and he concludes that the paper was soaked in a solution and then dried to create a strong, moisture-resistant wrapping. This discovery proves that the preservation method is the same technology used by the lizard brothers, Kashu and Kiku. After a short thoughtful pause, he turns to Tsutsuki, asking if she can overcome the communication barrier. He wants to find out what creatures like Au are called in the branch leg language, and she agrees with joyful enthusiasm. She quickly conveys the question and translates the answer, but the guttural sounds make him strain to catch the full meaning. He quickly reassures her, insisting that her efforts are invaluable, even though she does not know all the local dialects. She raises her eyes to him, and in her large, wide-open eyes there is both surprise and quiet thoughtfulness as she accepts his encouragement. Turning his attention to the entire settlement, he considers the next step and realizes, if he does not extract more information from others, he will remain stuck. He looks closely at the silent stranger, wondering if he is consciously refusing to speak or if it is simply a language barrier, and concludes that even with the help of his young companion, direct conversation may prove impossible. Suddenly, the lizard-like stranger pointed at him with a clawed finger and uttered one sharp word, "goblin," which hung in the air, and he froze for a moment, not believing his ears. The stranger repeats the word confidently, and he, embarrassed, involuntarily responds with the same, trying to understand what this name means. Quickly cross-referencing it with his knowledge, he notices that the word goblin is strangely similar both in the werewolf language and in the lizard folk language, a hint at a shared concept that he is just beginning to grasp. A chilling thought pierces him. Does goblin actually mean human for them? He hesitates, not wanting to rush to such a simple conclusion, but he cannot ignore the linguistic hints linking different descriptions of his kind. Amid these heavy thoughts, a sharp rumble suddenly sounded from the storage objects were moving inside, and he and his companion froze, watching as the things of the past rattled, while sharp knocks of wood and stone against the floor echoed in the cold air. He stands in quiet contemplation, choosing words for the next question and struggling with doubt whether his impulsive return to that shaggy beast was right, and when the girl asks if they should keep searching outside, he gently refuses, deciding that for now they have seen enough. Sorting through the scattered objects and wondering whether they are just things or eerie trophies of past battles, he cannot shake the question of who he really is, and the thought that he supposedly comes from the goblin cave makes the stranger's earlier accusation much heavier. He stands before the shaggy creature, which bluntly asks if he is a goblin. When he denies it, the creature simply believes him and says that in this world a name is how others call you. This thought immediately brings him back to the meeting with the reptilian traveler. Analyzing borrowings in the languages of different species, he understands. The word goblin most likely appeared because people called themselves that. Shaking off the mental fog from these linguistic puzzles, he decides to focus on the task. He kneels down next to the others and offers to help sort through the scattered things they found. His young partner Suzuki says that among this scattered junk no papers were found. Nearby, a huge bison-like beast emits a low resonant hum that makes the air tremble. Then the beast extends pieces of cheese to them, and Suzuki takes them with delight but cannot shake the thought that the creature is trying to appease them with food. Walking through the quiet settlement, he sees empty houses and tiny creatures bustling around and thinks, did the former inhabitants leave because of changes in their customs, or did they simply move to other homes? Later, he talks with the village elder, who notes the cozy warmth of this place. Nearby, Suzuki and the little monsters happily splash in his steaming bath, their laughter echoing in the cold air. Watching her enjoy the water, he realizes, when you see a resemblance in someone, you involuntarily start expecting that this person will feel and behave just like you. He shuddered with surprise when the old man leaned closer, and his wrinkled face blossomed with a warm, knowing smile that erased the distance between their worlds. Sudden closeness deeply changes him in his mind. The man is no longer just an image from distant memories of the dormitory, but a real inhabitant of this strange land, and he laughs off this discovery while the young she-wolf pulls his sleeve, her eyes wide open with curiosity, demanding to be let into the secret they seem to share. He looked at her with a soft, thoughtful gaze, simply shook his head and assured her that it was nothing important, keeping the burden of his thoughts to himself. His attention slid to the small bundle on his lap, a piece of cheese carefully wrapped in a scrap of parchment. While he examines the gift, a huge hairy beast slowly approaches, its figure casting a long shadow on him, and it quietly watches his reaction. The creature grumbled, offering more food, and the young man froze in shock. He recognized the wrapper. The lost scientific papers of the professor, thought to be lost forever, had been turned into simple wax paper for cheese, and the irony that such valuable thought had become an everyday wrapper made it impossible for him to speak. High above the clouds, the professor himself floats in a wicker basket, eyes fixed on the horizon, a quiet submission on his face, and the hot air balloon carries him away from the earth and from the secrets he left behind. Although the journey to the afterlife continues again and again, the exact moment when the path of the past cooled remains a mystery, lost in the shifting winds of time. He stands on the snowy ground and watches as the professor prepares to depart, and the man's private thoughts are now open in the records left behind. These documents reveal a deeply rooted belief in the possibility of contact between humans and werewolves, and the professor supported this theory with stories about travelers who were saved during wartime. They tell of one memorable encounter with a creature whose voices were unlike anything else, a wild, piercing scream that became the beginning of a unique connection. In these memories, the man recalls how the young werewolf greeted him each time with joyful barks at the landing site, her tail wagging happily from pure joy. He noticed that she was different from her kind and began learning their customs to better understand them. Meanwhile, she diligently copied his human manners. Eventually, her imitation went beyond simple gestures and reached a turning point when she tried to bridge the language gap between them by learning his name. She focused all her attention, forcing a low hum to escape from her throat, struggling intensely to reproduce the complex sounds of human speech. Under his patient guidance, she finally squeezed out a rough version of his name gouge, and it was a huge step that forever changed their relationship. He silently, with quiet admiration, watched as the young creature approached. Her movements were measured. she began imitating the sounds of his speech, a clear sign that her mind was awakening, and he was even more impressed that she understood the complex linguistic idea. Different sounds could mean him, linking their worlds. When she produced a series of rhythmic barks, he finally noticed the pattern. The dry grass she so often brought was not a random gift, but a symbol, her way of naming him in her own way. Although she had performed this ritual many times, only now did its true meaning reach him, and he realized how hard she had tried to communicate with him. He stood in the quiet, snowy vastness and suddenly understood. Her understanding was deeper. She felt the very structure of language, knew the roles of I, you, and the objects between them. At that moment, amid the cold air and bare trees, it became impossible to deny. There was a deep, mutual connection between them that went beyond their different natures. Hakaba looks into the distance, his face inscrutable, and feels the full weight of the information they gathered during the long journey. He looks at the professor's notes and suddenly realizes these are not so much scientific observations as a personal essay, and the wrappers from the same professor's papers were used to protect the community cheese, a detail that could not simply be ignored. Suzuki watches him closely, feeling how the professor's thoughts weigh on him like a heavy burden, and the professor admits that much of what is written, especially the sections about the war, still remains a mystery to him. Turning his gaze to the large, shaggy beast nearby, Hakaba lifted a piece of cheese and aloud wondered what it really was, and Suzuki, as always curious, leaned closer. She really wanted to see everything for herself. She takes a deep breath, her eyes wide open, and says, "It smells incredible." He looks at her with a gentle smile and asks if this scent reminds her of her father. While they settle in, the village remains a temporary refuge, with the guide who brought them here dealt with, and the group prepares to survive the long winter safely in the settlement. By mid-December, living became cramped. In Mao's house, Hakaba and Suzuki share the space with a small army of lamias, their snake-like bodies filling the room. He glances toward the exit as the massive beast begins to stir, and a premonition envelops him. The next step of their journey is near. Suddenly, he snaps out of his thoughts. Several lamias begin to coil their long snake-like bodies around him, and Sasuke, they shudder from the unexpected touch. He shouted in surprise, watching as the creatures slide and tightly wrap their torsos. Looking around, the young man realizes they are not alone. The lamias have wrapped others villagers as well, and it occurs to him that ancient human legends about Medusa might have arisen from travelers who saw something similar, but here the embraces are more practical than those that turn to stone. A large bird-like creature soaring under the pale sky wonders, do these snake women rely on others for movement, and does this sudden closeness mean they have finally accepted him in Sasuke, or are they simply targeting them as potential prey? Just after dawn, a diverse group struggles heavily through deep snow, forming a quiet procession against the backdrop of a winter landscape. Having spent several days shoulder to shoulder with the locals, he reflects on their wordless language and realizes, when words are short and only about the matter, it is easier to feel what each gesture means. Watching the huge werewolf who led the others, he showed Suzuki how leadership arises naturally even without a common language, and explained that the one who takes responsibility simply understands best what the work should be, just like during the bridge construction they saw earlier.